government savings and paper assets like mutual funds or stocks are at risk. But there is a way to avoid this disaster. Oh,
That revenue helps pay our bills. We'll also reduce our financial risk, our interest payments by bringing down our debt to GDP ratio, and then ultimately helping us stave off a debt crisis. Last hearing, we examined the effects of excessive and overreaching regulations and how they compromise our freedom, quench the entrepreneurial spirit, and suppress economic growth. We noted that President Biden, his regulatory track record at this point is 2 times previous President Obama, and the overall cost is at $360 billion. That is a major drag on the economy. We're going to focus today on the relationship between tax policy and economic growth and its fiscal impact on our country and our country's future. Unfortunately, we are far from a rigorous and thriving economy today, as our nation continues and our working families continue to suffer from sustained 40-year high inflation. Inflation is coming down. I want it to come down, but core inflation is sticking, and it's about the same as it was over the first year of this administration. We've seen the fastest pace of interest rate hikes in history. We've experienced 3 consecutive quarters of economic decline, with the most recent quarterly output at just around 1%. This is a direct result, in my opinion, of too much spending and wrong-headed policies. And I'll spare you all the litany of failed economic policies and the $11 trillion in spending that I believe have put us in this tough spot. And then for me, and I think most of our members, it's added $6 trillion to the national debt, which is already on an unsustainable course. We have to examine the relationship between good tax policy and our budget process. Congress has the power to tax. In 1913, the 16th Amendment gave us the power to tax directly to income. But what we pay for, scope, mission of our republic, who we tax and how we tax, is of the utmost importance as we seek to responsibly pay our bills and encourage growth and ensure financial health of the United States. History is replete with the evidence that when you reduce the tax burden on job creators and consumers, the economy grows. Kennedy did it, Clinton did it, Bush did it, Reagan did it, and whether it was significant or modest, the result was the economy grew. In fact, President Kennedy said that economic growth in the post-war era was the most urgent task facing our nation, which is why he proposed a tax reform package that, by the way, included a significant reduction in corporate rates. He said it was to step up the growth and vigor of our nation's economy, increase job and investment opportunities, and improve our productivity. As President Kennedy said, completing this task was about protecting the security of our people. Let me jump to the most recent example, tax cuts and jobs act. Very proud of what we did. Would it have paid for itself? It's a good question. I think that'll probably be very close to my colleagues. I don't know. I know that the economic feedback is positive. I know that we brought in more revenue than was projected and had to be upwardly revised several times by CBO. I think Republicans made a mistake not to include spending cuts. I'll say it, and I'll continue to say it. For a party that's so obsessed with out-of-control spending, for us to have the House and Senate and the presidency and to pass tax cuts and tax reforms and not reduce spending, which I think is the preponderance of the problem, certainly one of the 2 pieces of the equation here, growth and reduction in spending, I think is more than disappointing. I think it's shameful, actually. And we can't repeat that if we are given the opportunity. But what tax cuts and tax reform did was to generate more capital investment than we've ever seen, more R&D investment than we've ever experienced. We had the lowest unemployment rate. We had the lowest poverty rate in recorded history. 6 million people lifted out of poverty. A lot of benefits accrued to this country. Namely, people were having better opportunities, higher paying jobs, and they kept more of their money. And that we experienced an economic growth. Rather than to go through all of my notes here, because I know I've filibustered before, I would just say we have to have the most simple and efficient tax code. We have to find a way to make it more simple and simpler and more efficient. We have to have a fair and equitable tax code. And there's going to be debate about what that means. For me, to have 40% of the American people not having any stake in their country.
Try this 30 seconds bedtime ritual to reverse memory loss. It's so simple you can do it from the comfort of your home.
It's a problem. Have the top 10% paying 75% of the taxes. I think that's a problem. I think that's inequitable. But we can debate that. We should. And then finally, we need a productive, the most productive, and most competitive tax rate. We can't have China, communist China, have a lower tax rate on their businesses, their job creators, than we do in the United States. And even today, after lowering the corporate rates, you combine state taxes on businesses and federal taxes, you pay more than businesses in communist China, our competitor and our adversary. That's a problem. So let's work together, try to figure out how to get this right. We know the formula for success after World War II. Cut spending, right-size the government, the bureaucracy. Take on entitlement reform. That'll be a fun discussion. We haven't gotten there yet. But let's figure out how to grow this and leave our children a better country and a better spot with a brighter future. With that, I yield to the ranking member for such time as he may consume for his.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and glad to have this hearing today. Number of things I wanted to respond to, maybe some other occasion or some other format while I have a chance in a respectful, of course, way to go back and forth on some of these points that you raise. First, I would say, before I even get to my opening statement, we know definitively the answer to the question whether or not the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act paid for itself. The answer is no. And don't take my word for it. Sitting right at that chair, our guest at a previous hearing, Douglas Holtz-Aiken, clearly a well-respected right-of-center economist, his exact quote, so I don't misquote him here, 5 years when asked the question whether or not, I believe I was the one who asked him the question whether or not tax cuts entirely pay for themselves. He said, quote, "No serious economists would make such a claim." Now, tax cuts do have some stimulative effect, more of an effect when they're targeted in the right way versus others. But no, of course, they never entirely pay for themselves. Heck, if they did, then why not have a tax rate of 0.00001% if we thought that they were, oh wait, some of my friends might take me up on that. Oh geez, I think I just won the 2024 Republican nomination. But of course they don't pay entirely for themselves. Money does not grow on trees. And the reality is, when another witness testified to this, if people recall, I like to do callbacks for those longtime viewers of our hearings. When you add up the two Bush tax cuts, 2001 and 2003, and then, of course, they were extended jointly under split rule, President Obama and the Republican-led Congress, and then you add in the TCJA, we're missing $10 trillion. So when you look at that national debt figure, recognize that where some of that debt comes from. I'd also point out, since a favorite president of mine, JFK, was invoked, it is true, he did push for a tax cut. I'm not sure my Republican friends would like us to go back to what the marginal rates were after those tax cuts. They were significantly higher than the taxes we have today. Indeed, we have some of the lowest tax rates right now that we have ever had since having this modern system of taxation. Now, part of the title for this hearing is, quote, reigniting American growth. I have good news. It is already happening. More than 13 million jobs created over the last 2.5 years, the lowest unemployment rate since the 1960s. More jobs have been created in this presidential term than any other single term in American history. On inflation with the latest data that came out last week, inflation has now dropped for 11 consecutive months. It's still higher than what we would like it to be. But my goodness, are we in a different world than our friends in Europe? Their situation is much worse on inflation without the signs that it's necessarily going to get better soon. On this point, I had a German parliamentarian, a member of the Bundestag, in my office last week, a good ally of the United States. He was talking about the situation they're facing in terms of inflation and expressing the wish that inflation was in Germany what it is in the United States right now, with dropping so heavily. So once again, as I've said here many times, the United States continues to lead the worldwide recovery coming out of COVID. And we need to make sure we don't do anything that would jeopardize that. And finally, let me say on the other half of what I think this hearing will be, the trade picture, I'm glad that we're having a hearing talking about trade. We are 4% of the world's population. Sometimes, it's very easy. Being Americans, is very easy to forget that 96% of the world lives outside our shores. Mark Twain once said, America's two best friends in the world are the Atlantic and the Pacific. So sometimes we can have a more parochial view. The reality is, being only 4% of the world's population, we do need trade. However, I think it is clear, and in some ways, there might be Democrats and Republicans who agree on this. I think there have been trade deals over the last quarter century that have not paid close enough attention to the needs and concerns of American workers, especially America's blue-collar workers. There was a victory on that front, a bipartisan one that is not really talked about that often, and that was the revision of NAFTA, USMCA. A deal in which, for the first time, you saw a majority of organized labor in support. It got over 400 votes in House of Representatives. The same number of House Democrats and House Republicans voted for USMCA. So it shows that this isn't just rhetoric. I am a believer that we all have trade agreements that are in our national security interest, but also balance the need for growth and the balance to drive good prices for American consumers, with also protecting the interests of American workers. So with that, I will yield back and look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
I associate myself with the remarks of my colleague on trade, and I look forward to new market, new customers, American producers, manufacturers. With that, I want to thank my colleague. I mentioned that if any member has an opening statement, submit it for the record. I'll hold the record open to the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not yet have prepared written statements. Once again, I'd like to welcome our witnesses. Today, we're going to hear testimony from Dr. William McBride, Vice President of Federal Tax Policy, and Mr. of the Tax Policy Foundation, Mr. Kyle Parmalu, Senior Fellow on Tax Policy at the American Enterprise Institute, Mr. Kevin Kuhlman, Vice President of Federal Government Relations at the National Federation of Independent Businesses, and the Honorable Mark Mazur, former Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy at the United States Treasury Department. And we all extend our appreciation for your time and your insights. Committee's received y'all's written statements, and they'll be made part of the formal hearing record. You each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. Now yield 5 minutes to Dr. McBride.
Do hair relaxers cause cancer in women? Beauty product manufacturers may have put millions of women at risk. Recent studies suggest a possible link.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington. Thank you, Member Boyle, and members of the committee.
appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. My testimony will focus on the economic effects of recent changes to the federal tax code, including the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I recommend ways to boost economic growth going forward. TCJA reduced income tax rates broadly, both for individuals and corporations, lowering taxes for every income group, and improving incentives for work. Lower marginal income tax rates on labor and capital income. Lowering the corporate tax rate in particular improved the long run health of the economy by reducing the tax burden on corporate investment. As a result, the Joint Committee on Tax and the Congressional Budget Office both predicted more investment, more labor supply, and faster economic growth. However, several temporary features complicate the law and reduce its impact. On the individual side, all of the individual income tax cuts expire in 2025. On the business side, the ability to immediately deduct R&D expenses last year. Businesses are now required to delay those deductions for 5 years. Likewise, bonus depreciation initially allowed businesses to immediately write off the full cost of equipment. Now the future rules are returning and require businesses to delay those deductions for 20 years. We found TCJ's positive impacts on the economy would build in the first few years, resulting in a 3% increase in GDP and a 1.7% increase in wages by 2025. Smaller impacts in the long run. Comparison for outcomes is difficult due to confounding events such as the pandemic. However, at a high level, several measures point to a strengthening economy post-TCJA. GDP, investment, and labor compensation all improved in the 2 years after enactment of TCJA and before the pandemic relative to historic averages. Regarding tax revenue, while TCJA was estimated to reduce revenue initially, both our analysis and that of the JCT indicated it would raise revenue by the end of the budget window. Actual tax collections have exceeded expectations, hitting an all-time high in nominal terms last year at $4.9 trillion, 19.6% GDP, which is a 22-year high. Average federal tax collections in 5 years since TCJA's enactment are higher than forecasted by the CBO, higher than most years leading up to TCJA, and higher than the long-run average. In contrast to TCJA, President Biden's tax proposals would raise marginal income tax rates. While the proposals are ostensibly aimed at high-income earners, businesses, they would depress economic activity generally and reduce opportunities for workers at every level. Revenue raised with these tax hikes would in part be spent on tax credits and other subsidies for specific industries and taxpayers, further adding to the complexity of the tax code and expanding scope of the IRS. Going forward, lawmakers should focus on simplifying the federal tax code, creating stability, and broadly improving economic incentives. As a first step, lawmakers should permanently extend R&D expensing and bonus depreciation, a policy which would boost GDP by 0.5% over the long run and add about 87,000 jobs. As 2025 approaches, when much of the TCJA expires, lawmakers should consider fundamental tax reform to systematically address the tax code shortfall. While there are many options, we have recently detailed and analyzed a proposal that would substantially boost economic growth and opportunity. It follows along the lines of the Estonian income tax system, which tops our annual ranking of most competitive tax systems. Reform would fully integrate the corporate and individual income taxes to avoid double taxing corporate income. Instead of a complicated corporate income tax and separate rules to apply to pass-through businesses, all businesses would be subject to a simple 20% tax on distributed profits. At the individual level, a simple flat tax of 20% applies to all individual income except dividends, since they are already taxed by this distributed profits tax. Capital gains are taxed as ordinary income, also at 20%. Rather than a complicated state tax like accumulated savings and death, bequeathed assets are simply taxed as capital gains and sold by the heir, a deductible basis determined only by costs incurred by the heir. I find if such a system were implemented in the U.S., it would greatly simplify the tax code, saving taxpayers more than $100 billion annually and reduce compliance costs. In addition, our modeling indicates it would increase GDP by 2.3% and the long run, raise wages by 1.3%, and add 1.3 million jobs. My written testimony goes into other ideas along these lines. Happy to answer any questions you may have about that. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Dr. McBride. I now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Parmalee.
Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Kyle Parmalee, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. In my testimony, I'm going to put the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act's corporate tax proposals in an international context. I will make 3 points. First point is prior to the TCJA, the U.S. corporate tax code was an outlier among the 38 countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. 2, the TCJA brought the U.S. corporate tax code more in line with those of our major trading partners. 3, lawmakers should be cautious about some of the proposals in Biden's budget that could once again make the U.S. corporate code an outlier. Before the TCJA, the U.S. corporate tax code was an outlier in the developed world in a few important ways. The statutory corporate tax rate was 38.9%, which was the highest in the OECD. At the same time, the U.S. also levied high effective tax rates on corporate investment. The U.S. was also one of the last OECD nations to tax U.S.-based multinationals on their worldwide income. The pre-TCJA corporate income tax created several issues. First, the high statutory tax rate, combined with the ability to defer additional U.S. tax on foreign profits, encouraged corporations to shift profits and headquarters to lower tax jurisdictions. Second, high effective tax rates discouraged investment in the United States and encouraged corporations to locate highly mobile assets, such as intellectual property, overseas. And third, the high statutory tax rate, combined with the ability to deduct interest expense, resulted in a large bias in favor of debt financing investment. The TCJA addressed many of those issues and brought the U.S. code more in line with those of our major trading partners, reducing the federal statutory tax rate to 21%, brought the combined statutory rate to 25.8%, which is slightly below the OECD average of 26.2%. The lower rate reduced the tax burden on new investment, and in combination with the limitation on net interest expense, also reduced the bias in favor of debt financing. Current law tax treatment of U.S. multinationals foreign activity, which exempts the returns to tangible assets but places a minimum tax on intangible assets, is more aligned with how other OECD countries. But by no means will the TCJA corporate tax provision is perfect. For example, some of the TCJA tax provisions were temporary, such as 100% bonus depreciation, and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act raised the tax burden for research and development. Second, the new provisions aimed at preventing base erosions and profit sharing. Several short. The tax rate on these provisions are scheduled to rise after 2025, creating uncertainty.
If you're thinking of selling your house, want to know how much more you could be getting by using this brand new way to sell? The real estate market is rapidly shifting.
Lawmakers are right to want to extend both 100% depreciation and delaying amortization of R&D. But those changes should be made permanent and prospective, not temporary and retroactive. And looking forward, lawmakers should continue to expand expensing further and limit the deductibility of interest expense. The last point I want to make is that lawmakers should be cautious about some of the proposals in the Biden administration. These last couple budgets, the administration proposed raising the statutory corporate income tax rate from 21% to 28%. It proposed significant reforms to the tax treatment of multinational corporations' foreign profits. Under these proposals, the U.S. corporate tax rate would be 32.5%, and the second highest in the OECD. Effective tax rates on new investment would also be among the highest. Despite new limitations on interest expense, the proposal would also increase the bias in favor of debt financing. The Biden administration argues that its proposal to reform the tax treatment of multinational corporations would align the U.S. code with the global minimum tax, or Pillar 2, the OECD's proposal, but there would remain meaningful differences. In fact, their proposal would place a heavier burden on multinational corporations headquartered in the United States in Pillar 2. So under the Biden budget proposals, it would be less attractive to be a U.S. headquartered corporation, even if all countries enacted Pillar 2. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Farmaloo. Now we would like to yield to Mr. Coolman. 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, and members of the Budget Committee. My name is Kevin Coolman. Appreciate the opportunity to share the small business perspective today. Small businesses face economic challenges, including stubbornly high inflation and pervasive workforce shortages. Additionally, small businesses face a very uncertain tax future that makes business planning extremely difficult. Beginning this year, certain business provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 expire. In about 2.5 years, the vast majority of the provisions that benefit individuals and small businesses will also expire. If Congress fails to act, there will be a detrimental and substantial tax increase on millions of small businesses. Further, proposals to increase taxes on businesses cloud business optimism and complicate business planning. Small businesses receive significant tax relief upon the enactment of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. More than 3/4 of businesses organize as pass-through businesses, either S corporations, LLCs, sole proprietorships, or partnerships. Business income is passed through to the individual owner's income tax, Form 1040, where individual income tax rates are applied. For pass-through businesses, the 20% small business deduction, also known as Section 199A, combined with the lower individual tax rates and broader income brackets, provided tax relief that was invested in small businesses and their employees. For example, Lana Paul, owner of Geetings in Pella, Iowa, testified before this committee a couple years ago that the new small business deduction will provide around $40,000 in tax relief for our businesses. This tax relief provides crucial cash flow that allowed us to provide up to $4,000 raises for our employees, the largest compensation increases we have been able to provide in recent years. Retaining highly valued employees is key for our businesses to function. Small business tax relief was plowed back into people and production, not owners' pockets. Unfortunately, these provisions expire on December 31st, 2025. Nearly half of small business owners reported that uncertainty of expiring tax provisions is impacting their current and future business plans. Fortunately, Congressman Lloyd Smucker, a member of the Budget Committee, will reintroduce the Main Street Tax Certainty Act during the next congressional work period. This legislation would make permanent the 20% small business deduction, providing tax certainty for small business owners to grow their businesses. And FIB urges members of Congress to support this legislation by joining as an original co-sponsor. Further clouding business planning are proposed tax increases on small businesses. President Biden's fiscal year 2024 budget request would increase taxes on small businesses organized as corporations and pass-throughs. I included a list of certain tax increase proposals in my written testimony, but I would like to focus on the proposed 5% small business surtax on pass-through business income. The president's budget request describes this small business surtax as, quote, closing a loophole. The tax was originally created as part of the Affordable Care Act's reconciliation bill as a tax on investment or passive income. It was a deliberate policy choice to not apply the tax to active business income, which of course is not passive income. As former chairman of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, Jason Furman, described, it was not applied to active business income, quote, because it could be demonized as a tax on small businesses and doctrine. Deliberate policy choice is not a loophole. The proposed expansion of the tax would more than double the revenue collected, further demonstrating that the tax increase proposal does not close a loophole. If it is ultimately enacted, this substantial tax increase would reduce the ability of pass-through business owners to invest in their businesses and employees, as well as leaving them at a further disadvantage relative to corporations. Over a few months, NFIB collected over 21,000 signatures from small business owners throughout the country opposing the small business surtax and stating emphatically that small business is not a tax loophole. Small business owners shared their concern. For example, John Sullivan, owner of Dana Wahlberg in Westford, Massachusetts, wrote that as a pass-through entity, we pass through $1 million, but that doesn't mean we keep it for ourselves. We still pay out That out of that, long-term debt, mortgages, truck leases, etc., we don't take it home. When all is said and done, we take home less than $400,000. By taxing us on everything over $400,000 assumes we are keeping that money for personal consumption, and that is just not true. I recommend rethinking this 3.8% small business surtax on small businesses who are hanging on with all the issues they've had to deal with over the past 2.5 years. In conclusion, small businesses continue to face economic headwinds. Congress can help mitigate economic challenges by extending beneficial small business tax provisions, reducing paperwork, and rejecting tax increases on small businesses. Tax certainty will help businesses plan for the future and increase small business confidence. I appreciate your time and attention to these concerns. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Coolman. Now I yield 5 minutes to Dr. Passer.
Did you know that you could get $50,000 to over $150,000 of investment capital at 0% interest rates to fund any business or investment that you want? That's right. You can quickly and easily access $50,000 to over $150,000 of free money in less than 30 days to invest.
Mazer, I asked that question and I still couldn't get it right, so I apologize.
Well, members of the committee, thank you very much for having me here today to discuss this important topic concerning the federal tax code. The federal tax code administered by the Internal Revenue Service is responsible for raising $4.5 trillion a year that pays for all the goods and services provided by the federal government. Just to review some basics, when we think about any tax system, there are 4 main criteria we use to evaluate. 1, revenue adequacy. Does it raise enough revenue to pay for the goods and services that are demanded by the population? 2, efficiency. Is the revenue raised in a way that minimizes distortions? And distortions accompany taxes, so minimize them in that context. 3rd, is it equitable? That means 2 things. 1, are similarly situated taxpayers treated roughly the same, horizontal equity. And are taxpayers with greater ability to pay asked to contribute a larger share of their resources than those with less ability to pay? And finally, simplicity, where taxpayers know what the obligations are, know what the rules are, and can comply with the system without too much burden. Those are the ideal. Obviously, our system falls short on all of them. So we can talk about revenue adequacy to start. In the late 1990s, early 2000s, the last time the federal budget was balanced, the federal government raised about 20% of GDP in terms of revenue. Since then, the country has decided to increase spending on things like natural defense. And demographically, we have way more retirees than we used to have. We claim benefits from Social Security, Medicare, and so on. So if we're serious about balancing the budget, we'd be looking at something above 20% of GDP, not below. Last year, we had a one-time aberration to get up to 19.6% GDP. That would be a good start if we were able to maintain that. And that would take some action from Congress to actually raise revenue relative to in my testimony, I just do a quick little example of my personal situation. So in 1988, I looked at my effective tax rate. It was 21%. In 2018, 30 years later, my adjusted gross income was about 50% higher in inflation-adjusted terms. My effective tax rate was 19%. It's actually lower. I was paying less to the federal government for the services I was getting, which are roughly the same level of services 30 years later, even though my income is substantially higher. Why is that? Because we've had a series of tax cuts that have occurred over a long period of time. In 2001, 2003, they were extended again in 2012 and 2017, and several other times. And those outweighed the tax increases in 1993 and with the Affordable Care Act. And so really, we're asking people, relatively well-off people, to pay less than they used to pay to support the federal government. It doesn't seem like a strategy for getting the budget balanced. I know the hearing today is focused on tax incentives. Largely, one of the things that you keep in mind is almost all the tax incentives we have in place are inefficient, that they are not the most cost-effective way to generate the behavior that Congress is trying to generate. What we do with the current set of tax incentives is largely pay taxpayers to do what they would have done anyway. So just one example, bonus depreciation, which I know my colleagues here like. Basically, bonus depreciation says if you're investing in your business to maintain it, keep it profitable, and so on, completely deduct the cost of those investments. You would have done that anyway. We're not encouraging people to do much more than they would have done. Similarly, I talked a little bit in my testimony about things like 529 plans, which basically have people investments in taxable accounts. We don't think of it very much, but it does cost the federal government revenue. And so if we're looking about designing tax incentives, what we would focus on is where the behavior occurs, and then try very hard to focus attention on changing that behavior in a very cost-effective way. And as Kyle Pomerleau said, one of the things that we would currently not do retroactive tax cuts, because frankly, that behavior has already occurred in the past. We're not changing it by changing the tax law. So really, you want to, at a minimum, not do those things that will not change behavior. And with that, I'll just conclude here. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Mazur. We'll now begin our question and answer session. I'll yield myself 5 minutes. Let me start with you, Dr. Mazur. I think your comments were very thoughtful. I want to know, as a tax policy expert, is there a point at which, because you mentioned some of the tax incentives don't have the return on investment that some would say they do, but where is the point at which you have diminishing returns, and is there at which you're going to tax either businesses or individuals where you get less revenue because you have reduced investment, growth, etc.? Is there such an inflection point in your mind?
Well, for sure, you've heard of the Laffer curve, right? You've seen that picture drawn. So surely at 100%, that's not giving you much incentive, right? And so as you move back a little bit from that, you are able to generate additional revenue. But here we're looking at in today's world, the tax rates of 20, 20, 30, 40%. That is not even close to where an inflection point occurs. We're really far away. I think when President Kennedy talked about cutting tax rates, maybe we were close to it then, but really we're not there.
I'm not an expert on tax policy, but I am on the tax subcommittee on Ways and Means, and I've pondered what is the right rate for many years now. And I'm not dogmatic. It's not theology for me. But practically speaking, you look at our competitors around the globe, and you say to yourself, do we want to be the highest taxed business job creators in the world, or do we want to be the most competitive or somewhere in between? Because capital is going to flow in this global market to the most to where it's going to get the best return. And I think about pre-TCJA and how much capital was overseas, and how uncompetitive we were from a tax code standpoint. So you touched on this, Mr. Pomerleau, about bringing us in line. Let's just say, nobody knows the magic rate, but we know our rates relative to our competitors. And you said that if we implement President Biden's tax rates that he proposes in his budget, number one, it's about almost $5 trillion in new taxes. But you said it would bring us to the top taxed corporate rate or business rate in the OECD field, with the exception of one country. Who's the one country that would be taxing higher than the United States?
Actually, a small country, Colombia.
Colombia. Who's in the top 5 with the United States in that scenario where we would increase the corporate rates to 28%?
So the countries that would be up there with us would be some of the larger countries like Germany, France.
I read from a progressive or liberal tax policy think tank where corporate rates, the majority of corporate rate increases are passed on to consumers. It's as high as 70%, that we can debate that, but are corporate rate increases passed to consumers in lower wages and higher prices? And to what extent does that dynamic occur?
Yeah, this is a complex issue, and it also depends on what the base of your tax looks like, how much of it's towards investment. It's generally true that any tax is going to fall on the workers or companies. But the exact share really depends.
The government is inflating away your retirement savings. Here's how to stop them. If you're over 55 years of age and have more than $25,000 in your retirement account, you must see this. I'm about to reveal a little-known IRS loophole that could protect your nest egg from the looming money crisis. The government and the Fed are printing trillions of dollars to bail out failing banks, creating inflation and devaluing the dollar. The market is like a castle built on quicksand, ready to collapse at any moment. If you keep your retirement savings in paper assets like mutual funds or stocks, you are risking losing your hard-earned savings. But there is a way to avoid this disaster. A way to secure your financial future and safeguard your wealth with gold and silver. The only asset class that stood the test of time for thousands of years. As J.P. Morgan said, gold is money, everything else is debt. And history proves him right. In 1923, Germany suffered a hyperinflation that wiped out millions of people. But those who had gold and silver preserved their wealth and profited from the chaos. In 2008, the global financial system nearly collapsed. Millions of people lost their homes, jobs, and retirement savings. But those who had gold and silver saw their portfolios soar. And now, we're facing another crisis. The national debt is over $30 trillion and growing by the day. The Federal Reserve is printing trillions of dollars out of thin air, and banks are failing left and right. Do you want to risk your hard-earned nest egg in this unstable environment? Or do you want to secure it with real value that lasts thousands of years? If you choose the latter, then you need to act fast, because there's a limited window of opportunity to take advantage of this IRS loophole before it closes. And once it does, you'll be stuck with your paper assets that are losing value every day. That's why we created a free report explaining how to preserve your wealth with gold and silver using this IRS loophole. To show you simple strategies to protect your retirement savings in the current economy and bulletproof your hard-earned dollar for the future and your family's future. This wealth preservation report has simple strategies that less than 1% of people even know exist. Just tap the button below to let us know where to send it. Best of all, this report is free of charge. No obligation, no fees, and it's tax-free. So be one of the first to tap the screen and tell us where to send your free report. This is the limited time offer that could expire at any moment. Don't miss this chance to learn how to protect your retirement savings. Use the button below before it's too late.
Excuse me, I have a weird question, but can I look at your electric meter?
Well, why? What's up?
Well, I'm doing a little social experiment and I wanted to see your electric meter. I might be able to save you some money.
Sure, I guess. It's right here, actually.
Oh, I see.
So, what's up?
How much can you pay for your electricity bill?
Like three.
Go ahead, yeah.
The Treasury Department doing tax studies basically show that 70 or 80% goes to capital.
Goes to what?
Capital, not labor, not the.
One reason for that, by the way, is because the base of the corporate tax has a lot of expensing, which makes the corporate tax more neutral and less distortive for corporate investment.
Mr. McBride talked about the progressivity of the tax code, and many would say it's the most progressive of the OECD countries. Did the TCJA make the tax code less progressive or more progressive?
A couple of studies on this indicate that it was basically a wash or made it slightly more progressive.
Okay, so it wasn't less progressive.
No. Certainly demonstrably, when CBO looked at it, there are tax cuts across the entire income scale.
And we've heard this entire talking point about it was a giveaway to the rich, but my understanding is that lower income and middle income folks benefited as a percentage more than the higher income. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct, but I'm not entirely sure about the numbers in front of me.
Well, my time's expired, and I yield my ranking member for his Q&A.
So on the TCJA, Dr. Mazur, you may know this, but am I correct when I recall that the Congressional Budget Office found that over the 10 by 2026, 83% of the tax cut from the TCJA went to the wealthiest 1%?
Not aware of the actual number, but I do know that the benefits tended to go to higher income people, especially when you consider the corporate benefits being going to them.
And not just the richest 1%, but the richest 1/10 of 1% received a majority of the tax cut in the TCJA. Now, for most of this year, actually all of this year up until a few weeks ago, the major issue in the Capitol was the debt ceiling and whether or not it would be raised, whether or not the United States would suffer a first ever default. The alleged driver for those who didn't want to raise the debt limit was to win cuts because they were so concerned about the size of the national debt. Well, here we are, just last week, the House Ways and Means Committee passed a piece of legislation that would extend the TCJA, the GOP tax scam, and extend those tax cuts. Are you aware, perhaps, of how much that would cost in terms of adding to our national debt?
Tens or perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah, I believe over $2 trillion is what was. Sorry, I'm not attempting to put you on the spot.
Depends how long you do the
extension for. That's correct. Yeah, so I believe this was an extension that would cover 10 years or so, or at least make them permanent as far as the budget window. So, I mean, it's remarkable to me that the majority for months and months and months was talking about national debt, national debt, national debt. And then as soon as the debt ceiling is raised, they immediately pivot to making tax cuts for the richest 1% permanent that would add trillions of dollars to our national debt. It certainly calls into question the extent to which some are really concerned about our national debt. Now, you had, I think an interesting point in your written testimony, and you talked about it just kind of orally here. The level of taxation that you were paying decades ago, same individual, relatively, I think, same income, not deprived, but that was what I read. And just how much less you're paying now versus decades ago, and looking at that in relation to our deficit and debt issue. And I was wondering if you could just kind of expound on that, because I thought it was very interesting.
Sure. So I'm a pack rat, and I do keep my old taxes, and probably some of you older people do as well. I looked when I did my 2018 tax return, which was after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and looked at what my effective tax rate was over adjusted gross income, and it was 19%. And I compared it to what it was in 1988, roughly same household composition, but my income in 2018 was like 50% higher in inflation-adjusted terms. And my tax rate was 2 percentage points lower. My effective tax rate 2 percentage points lower. And so I guess what I took away from that was I'm benefiting at least as much from the federal government now as I did 30 years ago in terms of public goods that are provided, and I'm paying less for it. And frankly, I could afford to pay more. Right? There's no, I'm not near the poverty level or anything like that. So. And so really, I think what it showed is just as a country, we've kind of shirked our responsibilities for ensuring that we're paying for the goods and services that our nation demands.
And to be clear, it's just reclaiming my time, because this was something else that needed to be corrected. And we have two sides of this, obviously, the corporate income tax side and the personal income tax side. Personal income tax side, our top marginal rate, 37%, significantly lower than where it was in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Brief period in the 80s, it was a little bit lower, but for most of Reagan's presidency, it was higher. And then, of course, Clinton, when he came in, raised the top marginal tax rate, and what followed was a remarkable period of economic growth for most Americans, as well as our stock market and reduction in poverty. Now, on the corporate side, in the 15 seconds I have left, The TCJA, of course, lowered the top tax rate, nominal rate, from 35% to 21%, compared to what CBO predicted we would be getting in corporate tax revenues before the TCJA versus what happened afterwards. $100 billion shortfall, $119 billion shortfall the year after the TCJA took effect. Another $100 billion shortfall, $160 billion shortfall. Those were all in the next 3 years. Again, according not to my figures, but the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. So there is no question that the so-called Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was a massive tax reduction for corporations and the richest 1%. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. We'll now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Psychologists have discovered that procrastination isn't caused by laziness or lack of motivation, but instead it's your coping mechanism for dealing with your unconscious fears. So want to know the only way you can finally stop procrastinating? So let me show it to you right now, because this will transform your life, provided you take action on this, and you'll see how powerful this is. My name's Tim Ham, by the way, and I've been in this field of human behavior for the last 12 years of my life. I created a company called Success Insider, which in 2016 became the fastest growing personal development channels all across the globe. So I want you to pay close attention to this. Right now, if you think about it, you're in the present moment, right? And what you do right now is dictating your future. Is that correct? And so if you really think about it right now, it's actually very simple how your success happens. You got to take conscious action in the present moment that leads you to the future. But you and I know that's easier said than done, because we sometimes fear what might happen. True? And that's creating sometimes stress or anxiety. And as a result, think about it, what do you tend to do? You tend to do not a lot. So why does this happen? Because we know logically we want to basically reach these big goals. Well, the reason why is because your brain is not designed to make it successful. Your brain is hardwired to keep you safe. Depending on what you've gone through in your life, in terms of your past, this is dictating your present moment. So every single day, you're like a hamster on the wheel, reliving every single day. Can you relate? So what needs to happen for you to free yourself from yourself? You must reinvent yourself. You must create an identity that's already accomplished these big goals. Here's what this looks like. Once you've created this identity that's already accomplished these big goals, guess what? You no longer fear anything because you believe deep inside you've already accomplished it. How does this process work? Well, the moment you create this identity, this is the identity that will be driving you to the future. And remember, the strongest force in the human psychology is the need to be congruent with how you identify yourself. In other words, your behavior never deviates from its internal mapping. You got to reinvent your current internal map. That's how you create permanent, long-lasting behavioral changes in your life. If you'd like to discover exactly how you can do that in your life, and how I did that in my life, as well as I put in my students group, I'm hosting a free live web class very soon, and I'd love to have you part of this because this is a transformational process. You're claiming a free spot. All you have to do is click the link here. And
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The ranking member's view of Trump tax cuts reminds me of the story of the economist who said, well, that might work in practice, but it'll never work in theory. My Democratic colleagues seem to believe that taxes are simply a cash box with a dial. Turn it up, they produce more revenue. Turn it down, it produces less. But Mr. Mazur touched on this, the laughter curve, which explains why that view is so wrong. A 0% tax rate, of course, produces zero revenues, but so does a 100% tax rate produce zero revenues because it utterly destroys the incentive to produce. So as the tax rate rises, the incentives to produce new wealth slowly diminish, and the incentives to avoid or evade the tax slowly increase at the same time. So the curve reaches a point of equilibrium, in which an increase in tax rates actually produces lower tax revenues. Mr. Right, am I heard that right?
Correct. That's certainly a real thing.
And history teaches us very clearly that this is the case. In the last 60 years, the top income tax rate has been as high as 91%, and it's been as low as 28%. But federal tax revenues have stayed remarkably steady at between 13% and 20% of GDP. Indeed, some of the lowest tax revenues came when the top tax rate was at its highest, and some of the highest revenues came when the top tax rate was quite low. But although the tax rates within this envelope has remarkably little effect on revenues, I do think that it has a big impact on economic growth, and experience, practice, tells us that that's the case as well. We keep hearing that the Trump tax cuts favored the wealthy. Well, Mr. McBride, you're tax foundation, right?
Correct.
Didn't you folks report that the taxes paid by the top 1% went up, while the other 99% of Americans saw their taxes go down with the Trump tax cuts?
The share of the taxes paid by the top 1%, yes, reached at least a 20-year high.
The top 1% actually saw their share rise from 38% to 40%, correct?
Right.
And the top 1% of taxpayers, they earned 19% of all income in the country, and yet they ended up paying 40% of all of the income tax revenues. Do you have that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So when they say the wealthy ought to pay their fair share, what they're really arguing for is to cut their taxes in half. Do I have that right?
Sounds right, yes.
When we cut taxes during the Trump administration, did tax revenues go up or go down?
They certainly went up, and they went up beyond expectations.
But the deficit also went up. Why was that?
Spending went up.
And faster, right?
Much more, yes.
I'm trying to point out to my friends on the other side, it's really stupid. That's the point. Deficits are simply a deferred tax. We borrow now, and then we have to pay it back in the future, or we simply inflate the economy, and everybody pays it back at the grocery store and the gas station. This administration's science of both of those. When Reagan cut taxes, did tax revenues go up or go down?
Your ranch is your home. It is built unlike any other, and what'll be left behind long after you're gone. Well, no two ranches are the same. A basic cattle handling system is simply not good enough. What you need is a system that brings you one step closer to a better today for a secured tomorrow. Introducing your custom cattle handling system, a cattle handling solution designed for you, your ranch, your family, and your future.
They went up eventually.
Well, eventually, because the tax cut was postponed for 2 years. And as Art Laffer had explained to President Reagan at the time, Mr. President, how much shopping do you do at a store the day before they have their year-end sale? But the point is the economy responds to this. And the Democrats used to understand that. When Truman took office, he abolished the excess profits tax. He slashed federal income tax rates. And we had the post-war economic boom. The ranking member's right. Clinton did raise taxes shortly after taking office. And he took such a drubbing at the polls, they lost the congressional majority. He completely reversed course, came to the Congress and declared the era of big government is over. And what did he do? He provided what amounted to the biggest capital gains tax cut in American history. He restrained federal spending, actually reduced federal spending as a percentage of GDP. And we had explosive economic growth in 4 years of balanced budgets. You would think that with that practice in hand, the left would abandon their socialist theories, which have never worked here or anywhere else they've been. I see my time's up.
I thank the gentleman from California. Yield 5 minutes. My friend, Mr. Higgins from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of things. America remains the world's richest, most dynamic, and productive economy. It's the largest economy. It's 25% of the world's economy. It's a $24.5 trillion economy. America was 40% of the world's 7 largest economies in 1998. Today, it's 58%. or an 18% increase. America is home to 11 of the top 15 universities in the world. Tech investment raised $150 billion, or 49% of the global total, more than double that of China. In the United States today, as ranking member has said that U.S. recovered from the coronavirus pandemic faster than any major economy in the world. Unemployment is at a stunning low, 3.4%. Biden's economy grew 3 times the average pace of the previous economy. Real incomes are rising. Manufacturing is booming with 800,000 new jobs. Employment has grown under this administration by 14 million jobs. Inflation, which this month is at 4.1%, is lower than the global average of 5.2%, lower than the average inflation in Europe. Even the budget deficit, 15.6% of the economy at the end of the Trump administration, has dropped to 5.5%. Now, I'm just looking at the last 34 years. That 3 Republican administrations, and you've had 4 Democratic administrations. You have 4 recessions and 4 recoveries. Under George H.W. Bush, was 1, deficit grew by $300 billion and drove the economy into recession. Under the Clinton administration, we fixed the broken Bush economy and grew the economy by 4% each year, sustaining the period. $400 billion left. Bush 2, George W. Bush, $260 billion surplus. Bush 2 took the Clinton surplus and turned it into a $1.2 trillion deficit and drove the economy into its worst recession since the Great Depression in 2008. Bush Obama came in and cut the Bush deficit by $600 billion. Trump increased the deficit by nearly $2 trillion, lost 3 million jobs, including 200,000 manufacturing jobs, and accumulated $8 trillion in debt, which necessitated raising the debt. Biden created 14 million jobs. I mean, there's a trend here. In each of these administrations failed economically, adopted a supply-side economic policy, disproportionately good tax cuts. Then we're saved by the Democratic administration invested in the growth of the American economy, and that's what the economy did under those administrations. Amazing. What am I missing? Sorry.
That we all tend to do is overstate the role of the tax system in what's going on in the U.S. economy. It's a contributor, but it's not the driving force. The U.S. is a very strong economy. As you point out, 4% of the population, 25% of the world's economic output. That means we're in a position where we have lots of strengths. Well, good labor force, good capital markets, good rule of law, supportive federal government, supportive and so on. So the tax system is part of the process. I guess I might quibble a little bit with assigning blame to each of these administrations or credit. It is true that the economic policies of the Democratic administration tended to raise taxes and put you in a better fiscal position. That part is true. But whether
does infrastructure investment grow the economy?
Yeah, I think that one of the major benefits of the infrastructure that we have is it allows there to be high rates of return investment in every state of the country.
Because that is an investment growth productivity. Not contribute to the economy. What I'm simply pointing out here is that there is a trend this historical action. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Estes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Acting Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'm glad we're having this hearing today and talked a lot about last week's CPI numbers and confirmed that the American economy does need help to be reignited. The Kansans I represent are still suffering under Biden inflation, and tax policy lays an important foundation for helping economic growth for everyday Americans. Families and small businesses have suffered for more than 2 years under the failings in this economic policies of the Biden administration. Inflation's up 5.5% since Joe Biden took office in January, much higher than any of his predecessors over the same period of time. And instead of addressing this issue, the president in his budget proposed $4.7 trillion in tax increases at a time when Kansans are already paying 14 cents out of every dollar they earn in direct federal taxes, not including the taxes they have to pay through the purchases of businesses that ultimately pay taxes from the income from Kansans. This is opposite of incentivizing economic growth if we want to increase that amount. I do have a couple of ideas about tax policy that the president could put in place to make that important, and I want to talk about that a little bit. But one of the things I want to just touch on that was brought up earlier, and talking about the difference between in theory versus in practice. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. Obviously, it's sort of like an investment that you might make in a business. Is that you change the tax code to make sure that you incentivize the behavior you want, and as a result, we've seen the economy take off and grow. So the first few years, you may have lower tax revenue, as mentioned by my friend, the ranking member. For the first couple of years, first 3 years, that went into place, and tax revenue was down over prior years. But the last 2 years, we've turned the corner. That investment from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act raised over $200 billion more than the CBO estimated in 2021. And in 2022, raised over $900 billion in actual tax receipts, more than what the CBO estimated. So obviously, we're seeing some positive results out of that by making sure the economy keeps going. I mentioned there's a couple bills that the president could consider to help get the economy going. One's a bipartisan bill, the American Innovation and R&D Competitiveness Act, that restores immediate expensing for research and development costs. This legislation was part of the larger tax cut and economic growth package that we passed the Ways and Means last week, the Build in America Act, and we reported out, has already been reported out in committee. It's a promising start. They'll change our tax code to help generate innovation and foster job growth, so that we don't seek any more ground to our adversaries. Just as a point of reference, our main competitor, China, has seen its R&D investments increase 400% in just 2 decades. While the United States' share of global R&D investment in 2019 was 30%, China's was 24%. That's a far cry from where we were in 1919 or 1999, when the U.S. was at 40% and China was at 9%. So obviously, we've seen a huge growth making those smart investments. Mr. Coleman, will restoring R&D expensing reduce the tax burden on new investments, and how will that help spur economic growth?
Yeah, I think yes, Congressman, it will. It's especially a big deal when cash flow is tight and as interest rates are increasing. That is certainly the case. I've been hearing, particularly from manufacturers, engineering firms, architecture firms, technology companies, that it certainly would be helpful.
Well, thank you. And the second thing we need to do, talking about tax policy, we need to focus on what's being bantered about by the Biden administration on the OECD Pillar 2 tax scheme that the administration's been pursuing. Basically, what their proposal is that the OECD would dictate what U.S. companies pay as a tax rate on operations inside the United States, and actually would be detrimental to U.S. tax receipts. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, if this global implementation of the global minimum tax as defined in Pillar 2 is implemented, the United States will lose $120 billion in tax revenue that'll be lost. And even if the United States changes its tax code to match and to copy what the rest of the world does, we'd still lose $58 billion in tax revenue. So businesses are going to lose money, and we're going to get less tax revenue in the United States. That's just a poor policy, and we need to make sure we don't proceed down that route. So I know I could go on for a lot longer, but I'm out of time, and I'll yield back.
Mr. Blumenauer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hesitate to remember.
Ms. Chakowski is now recognized.
There were actually more Democrats who voted for the NAFTA review than Republicans. Just the record, keep the record straight.
Hi, this is Katie Porter. I'm officially running for the U.S. Senate in California, and I need your support. Here are 3 reasons why your donation right now makes a real difference. 1, investing in our campaign now gives us the best chance of success. The stakes in the U.S. Senate are too high, and we need a warrior in Washington. 2, I don't accept a cent of corporate PAC or lobbyist money. Some candidates rely on big donors and special interests to fund their campaigns, but I have always stood up to corporate power. I work for you, not them. 3.
But I do appreciate you and Mr. Higgins laying out the facts regarding whether or not somehow the economy is some sort of rapid decline as a result of 29 months of the Biden administration. There have, in fact, been more jobs created, 13 million additional jobs compared to the miserable experience that we had under the 4 years of the previous president. Those are facts that can be verified. We have 28 consecutive months of job growth under the failed policies of President Biden. We are at historic low record of unemployment. And for Black Americans, it is an all-time, hardly characteristic of failed policies. In terms of growth, in terms of jobs, those are examples of where it is in fact working. And as have been pointed out here before this panel, problems of inflation are not unique to the United States, but in fact, the record of the United States is that we have done a better job of dealing with inflation than the other major economies around the world. I mean, again, Germany, France, Italy, United Kingdom have experienced far more unemployment than inflation than we have. And I would suggest that it's important to try and put this, we can go ahead on our rhetorical flourishes and talk about theories about what would work or what not, and make rhetorical attacks based on socialist policies and communism and other delusional theories. But the fact is, our democracy and its economy are doing better than any other major economy in the world. And it's time that we'll be able to reflect on the performance of the Biden administration. It seems to me, as we're talking about taxation and generating revenue, I'm saddened to say that my colleagues, when they got their hands on the levers of power and be able to advance policies, one of the first policies they advanced would increase the deficit by slashing enforcement of our taxes. Now, we can debate about what the right level is and who should pay it, but I think it is unconvertible that people should pay the taxes they owe now under the existing system. And those of you who purport to represent small business, I would think that you would want to make sure that they are protected by making sure that people who owe taxes pay what they are responsible for doing. That should not be an item of contention. The lowest and less
tax system that has the least friction is collecting the taxes that are already due and are not being paid. And sadly, the evidence is the further up the food chain you get, the richer you are, the larger the corporations. They have less compliance, not more. We ought to embrace those investments to inject a sense of fairness so that they are not disadvantaged by people who cheat. That is not in anybody's interest. Finally, it seems to me that the recent proposal to gut the Inflation Reduction Program, it sent investments in alternative energy, which are working. There are billions of dollars that are being committed, largely in red states, to take advantage of those provisions. And it's sad. The majority wants to strip those out of the tax. Mercifully, they won't be successful. And they shouldn't. Bergman.
Hey there. If you're a wellness professional, I'm going to let you in on a little secret that may just transform your business. Hi, my name is Brian Kelly, and I've interrupted your video today because you need to know about a massive shift that's taking place in the health and wellness industry. And trust me when I say you're not going to want to miss this. It's all about a new up-and-coming trend called transformational breathwork. Now, if you've never heard about this technique before, that's okay. Odds are by this time next year, you're going to be hearing about it all around the health and wellness industry. And so what happens with this style of breathing is a phenomenon called transient hypofrontality. And essentially what that means is temporarily the prefrontal cortex, the home of the monkey mind, the home of the conscious mind, shuts down. And when that happens, it opens up the door to the subconscious domain. That's where all of our thoughts, all our emotions, behaviors, actions, even imagination and intuition are stored. So what happens is this paves the way to massive breakthroughs and massive transformations in a very short period of time. And so what you have access to today is to be one of the leaders in this industry to not only deliver your clients amazing results in a short period of time, but also to set yourself apart from everybody else in a $4.25 trillion health and wellness industry. So if you want to learn more, I invite you to attend a free 15-minute masterclass where I go over all the details, show you what this is all about, let you experience it for yourself. All you need to do is click on the link in this video, and that will give you instant access. So go ahead and click now, and we'll see you on the inside.
That's the first place they're going to look is the website, your website. They're going to Google you, they're going to find your name, and they're going to want to know who you are. So your website is like one of the most important things, I think, as a real estate agent. It's our image, it's our brand, and everybody Googles, right? So you want to have a kick-ass website.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find it interesting that too many of us in our 435 member body spend the 5 minutes of valuable oxygen consumption time talking rather than listening. But it is what it is. We all run every 2 years, and we have to figure out a way to get back in. So let's talk to the folks that are sitting somewhere in a mom and pop restaurant today with a huge job that maybe employs 4 or 5 folks. So if they were listening to this, it's on their lunch break, and all their employers are listening. How much of what has been said here today do you think they would understand as it relates to their daily lives? And are we, whether it be us here on the dais or you at the table, are you actually not necessarily thinking in terms that they will understand, but utilizing examples that small mom and pop business understands? Anybody want to offer comment? Are we in our own little bubble here? Because we have these high level philosophical, in a lot of cases, non-decision making discussions. Anybody want to offer comment?
Congressman Bergman, thank you. We just last week there were about 200 small business owner members in town, met with many offices, including yours and you. So thank you for meeting with them. But we just encourage them to tell their story, share their story about it. We follow it at a macro level, but we always think that individual stories are more important. And it was, our tax relief was reinvested back into people and into their production, and not into their.
And we, as the federal government, made it too complicated. So the point is, if we've made it too complicated, we looked at, we talk about, or we talk about taxing the wealthy, which is, I think, if I remember my first term in budget 7 years ago, the math was going to tax the wealthiest 1%, 115% of their income. See a little bit. That still didn't even come close to getting to reducing the national debt. The numbers don't match. It's a nice soundbite to play, but the math doesn't work. So I'd like to hear from whoever wants to offer comment on the following statement. If we eliminate, was it a fair statement to say that corporate income tax is very simply passed along to the end to the consumer? If I'm a business and I pay corporate tax and I do my structure and I do what my market forces will allow me to do as a business, is it fair to say that corporate taxes are past those expenses and paying the corporate taxes eventually passed along soon?
Yes, and especially in an environment now where businesses have become as efficient and productive as possible, with high inflation. Certainly the costs do.
So the point is it time that should we just consider getting rid of the corporate income tax because the consumer pays it anyway? And if you're a corporate executive making $20 million a year, you just pay that tax on it, and that revenue comes direct to the government.
The literature shows, and if we talk
about the literature
from Treasury, Joint Tax Committee, Congressional Budget Office, shows that about 80% of the corporate income tax is borne by capital. So shareholders generally pay for that, not consumers. Now, the other 20%, 30% is borne by labor and consumers. So there's a portion of it. But
when you said borne by capital,
yeah, shareholders.
Okay, so the point is in the long term, if we're trying to create an economy that is streamlined, so that people working, whether you're the business owner or just that employee there working there and paying your personal income, that you can live the kind of life that your grandparents had hoped for when they were struggling through the 30s and 40s. I see my time is running out, so I guess we'll have to take that for another time. But I will always defer to Mr. McClintock because of his ability to take these complex things and break them down for folks like me.
As much as it pains me to interrupt the gentleman, such a compliment. The gentleman's time's expired. Mr. Ballot. His ballot.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here today. Talk about these issues. They're very important. to me. I come to this hearing as a teacher from Vermont who's worked in 4 different rural public schools and have really direct experience with dealing with rural poverty. And right now, 1 in 18 Americans live in what writer Matthew Desmond has called deep poverty. 1 in 18. He said it's so low, he refers to it as subterranean level of scarcity. And rates of poverty in this country have really not changed since the 1970s. And today, a minimum wage full-time worker cannot afford a 2-bedroom apartment anywhere in America. Anywhere. So in all of our districts. And this obviously should trouble all of us, that people are working as hard as they possibly can. Okay? We can talk about investments, we can talk about stocks, we can talk about who's better off. I can tell you, most folks are not better off right now. Dr. Major, as you know, for decades, the Republican Party has carried out essentially the same playbook of cutting taxes for the rich and then feigning concern over the deficit. We just went through this. It's really fresh in our minds. And then proposing spending cuts to vital programs such as Social Security and Medicare. And I know my colleagues are also teeing up part 2 of the Trump tax cuts when we haven't even been able to pay for the first phase. First phase cost us a whopping $1.9 trillion and has led to a proliferation of billionaires in the United States. In 2018, for the first time ever in our country's history, the richest class of Americans paid a lower tax rate than working Americans, and the average effective tax rate of the top 0.1% of households dropped by 0.5%. The greatest legislative achievement did nothing to address the unbelievable wealth inequality in this country. And according to April data from Forbes, the United States now has 735 billionaires, the highest number of billionaires in the world, who consistently use our tax code to the maximum advantage at the expense of American working families, like the Vermonters in my district. And just this week, we learned that one of these billionaires may be exerting influence over the Supreme Court. According to ProPublica, hedge fund billionaire Paul Singer spent some of his vast fortune to take Justice Samuel Alito on a luxury fishing trip. And he repeatedly had cases concerning his company in front of the Supreme Court. Now, I'm a daughter of an immigrant, and my parents, like so many others, sought to achieve the American dream here. However, the current American tax code has rendered the American dream basically unattainable for most people. Dr. Major, it's difficult for many of us to imagine it, but what would a more equitable tax structure look like today? What's possible?
So a couple things about it. One is that could rebalance the tax code so that higher income people pay a larger share of their income for taxes. And that could be either through payroll taxes for Social Security or Medicare or through income taxes. You could look at the preferential rate on capital gains and dividends. There's a lower rate put on dividends that was supposed to account for the 35% corporate tax rate. It did not get changed when the corporate tax rate went to 21%. You could imagine changing that.
Can you unpack that a little bit more for people? Because I think that's really important.
Sure. So Congress passed a lower tax rate on dividend income back when the corporate tax rate was higher than it is today. And part of the stated reason was that, well, corporations already pay a high rate of tax. They're being double taxed on this dividend as it comes through. But when the corporate tax rate was dropped, the preferential rate wasn't changed at all. So you kind of get a double benefit from that. So those are just a few things. One point that you made that I think deserves emphasis is look at the minimum wage.
Yeah.
We have not increased the minimum wage in the United States in decades.
It's disgusting, is what it is. It's disgusting.
Yeah, and you're right that you can't afford to live on a minimum wage job.
No. You can work 40 hours a week in this country, making minimum wage, and not be able to afford housing, basic housing, not great housing, basic housing for your family. This should not be happening. We should not be letting it happen. So I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. So I just want to go through a couple of things here that just kind of make my brain hurt a little bit. We've got my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are screaming about corporate America paying their fair share. Okay? If we, whatever that number is, okay, because of the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure plan, there have been trillions of dollars, over $1 trillion worth of tax credits made available to corporate America, right? So the very people that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say they want to pay higher taxes, the wealthiest corporations and the wealthiest individuals can now buy these tax credits and their effective rate becomes zero. Correct?
Welcome to the most sustainable way to eat. This system works by moving heat from the ground into your home in the winter and then back into the ground in the summer to cool it down. Thank you for joining us in liberating homes from fossil fuels.
No, that's correct. Yeah.
All right. So we're screaming about corporate America paying more taxes, and yet we're going to turn around and give them what now is about a $1.2 trillion tax credit to offset the tax rates. So we're going to raise you, but we're going to allow you to pay zero. I just want to make sure I'm right on that, right?
No, that's absolutely correct.
Okay, I got that.
It's called
Number two.
subsidizing and penalizing at the same time.
Exactly. So that's number one. Number two, Pillar 2, OECD. That is going to remove $300+ billion from the revenue stream if that goes through. $300 billion. So now we're telling corporate America we want you to pay more and higher taxes, but we're going to give you a $1.2 trillion offset. And then, by the way, we're going to give about $300 billion of our taxing authority away to other countries. Now, that to me just is a really bad policy. And then I hear my colleagues talking about raising tax rate, lowering tax rate, doing it with Clinton, doing it after Clinton, before Clinton. We need to recognize that we are in a global economy, and we need to be doing everything that we can with our economy to make America the best place in the world to invest, create jobs, and sell around the world, period. So we can have a lot of discussions over spending where things should go, but the unifying philosophy for this body should be, are the decisions that we're making make America more competitive or less competitive? Do they create more jobs? Do they take away more jobs? Are we doing more to invest in research and development and come up with new ideas? Or are we trading that away to other parts of the world? So when we look at all of this debate about revenue and spending, I raise the corporate rate 10%, raise the individual rate to 40%. These folks are going to take advantage of the refundable credits and make their effective tax rate zero. What the heck does that make sense? I mean,
the major outcome of that approach is complication, further complication of the tax code. So the lots of measures of how complex the tax code is, but one is the number of words, about 4 million words and counting.
All right. So if for folks that have not lived in an area or that currently do live in an area without a manufacturing base, okay, it is incredibly difficult to sustain a community or a county or a state unless you have manufacturing there. Okay. I mean, it just is. And when I say manufacturing, a major job creator that is the economic backbone of a county or a city or a region. That is what feeds off all of the other small jobs and small businesses that we see growing in a community. So if we raise the corporate tax rate, okay, and we do not get away, and we don't move off the side on this tax trade policy that we've got, we're falling further behind. And by the way, we're going to see less tax revenue coming in because we're giving people refundable credits and we're giving away part of our taxing authority up to the tune of about $300 billion. And by the way, what does that do? Does that do anything for American competitiveness and job creation? Mr. McBride, I'll let you answer that question.
No, What it does is you could say level the playing field, but levels the playing field across the world with a higher level of corporate taxes, which.
But wait, but I mean, all right, so level it with higher,
but
level it with higher taxes. But we have our biggest corporations aren't going to be paying taxes because they're going to use the refundable credits from the
So what we're getting is a high marginal rate that applies generally, combined with a bunch of preferences for specific companies.
Time has expired, but thank you for helping me expose the hypocrisy of this conversation. I feel bad.
Thank you. So, this committee comes up with very interesting titles. The second part of the title of today's hearing is Incentivizing Economic Excellence Through Tax Policy. But I would think that's more accurate for saying what we have right now is incentivizing economic inequality through the new tax policy. And, we are the richest country in the world, except that we are also, I think, number one in the world of industrialized nations of the unequal distribution of that wealth right now. There are 3 American families. It's Bezos and Musk. No, it isn't Musk. It's Buffett and what was it? Okay, anyway, 3 American families that I went to my own time that has as much wealth as the bottom half of Americans. Think about that. And you heard, I thought, a really good explanation and examples of how this has affected Americans in our country. And so it just seems to me that we need to focus, if we're really concerned about not just equity. And let me ask you, Secretary Mazur, you mentioned what it takes to have, and I don't want to blame everything on tax policy, but you did say that you thought people that have the most ought to pay more. How would you justify this to some people in this room?
For anyone between the ages of 49 to 64 who is unable to work for medical reasons, this is a game changer. As you may be aware, you could be getting paid as much as $3,627 per month from the government in the form of SSDI benefits. But you may have heard how hard it is to apply for SSDI. I had heard that nearly 70% of people who applied are denied, usually because of simple mistakes on their application. And I heard that people who are approved often wait years to get their benefits. There's good news, though, for anyone between the ages of 49 to 64 who is unable to work for medical reasons. I just learned that there's a free service that helps people apply for SSDI up to $3,627 per month without ever leaving their house.
Criteria of good tax policy is vertical equity. What vertical equity means is higher income people pay a larger share of their income than lower income people. That's reflected in the progressive tax rate schedule, but there could be other ways to do that as well. And it really is just a basic sense of fairness, that those who get the most from the system sort of pay the most for maintaining that system.
So right now, what we are seeing is that the Republicans have a proposal of a major tax cut. It looks like it will also go to the wealthiest Americans, and at the same time, talking about paying for it through things like that have been suggested, cutting Social Security, raising the age to 1989 proposal by the majority of the Republicans right now. And I've been looking at so-called entitlements, which of course people pay for through every paycheck. Is this, in your view, as someone who deals with the economy, going to make our economy stronger? These choices of lowering the tax cuts, mostly to the wealthy, and cutting the benefits and the programs that help lower the economy.
I mean, I think making the country stronger from a fiscal perspective requires two things. One, more revenue, and two, some brakes on spending. I think Chairman Harrington talked about that as the two levers that you can move. And really, it's a matter of balance, getting that right. Our revenues today are too low to pay for the goods and services that we as a country demand. If we want to demand less, that's okay. But we still need to raise the revenues to pay for the ones that we demand that are out there. And you're right about some of the entitlements. People have paid into them with the understanding that they'll be there for them when they retire, Medicare and Social Security in particular. And so those are promises to future generations that we as a country need to redeem.
The other wealthiest is Gates, Warren, and Buffett. At least, okay, I yield that. Mr. Moore.
We know it's not me. Probably anybody in this room.
Thank you.
I wish the chairman was here, because I don't like to give other people compliments on my birthday. I try to reserve those solely for myself, but I'll be remiss if I didn't just hit on the topic of credibility. It's a currency that is dwindling in this place of Congress, unfortunately. And I really appreciated his opening statements. To be able to stand in front of a sitting committee and fully state that he wishes his party, my party, and I share the sentiment, could have done more and would have done more about spending, overall spending, mandatory direct spending or discretionary spending across the board. Wished in 2017 when we had majorities in the White House, the House, and the Senate. Wish we would have done more. We would have had a stronger argument, what I think is a pretty strong argument with respect to the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, but I truly wish that would have been the case. And I appreciate his willingness to be, he's somebody that has always led that way. He's inspired me. Why I want to put him on both of the committees that he's on. And it's a currency that we just don't have much of back here, and I've appreciated that from our chairman. And also, the minority witness, Mr. Missouri, you earlier said I would quibble or I would hesitate to just fully lay blame or cast the context that it's laid out that it's this president did this president did this. I've heard it communicated oftentimes. Sometimes the economy is what makes the president, actually. And, our economic cycles go in a certain way that sometimes catch the tail end. I don't blame the entire 2008 financial crisis on President George Bush. No way. Right? That has been policy that has gone on for years, or neglect of a lot of different things with lots of players. So I appreciate, that concept of credibility. And I was back in Utah with my colleague from the 3rd District, John Curtis, Representative Curtis, and he actually put it better than I've ever heard anybody say it. And I'm going to talk about calling the Tax Cut Jobs Act the tax scam for the rich. I'm going to just emphasize the way he communicated it. He said, "Never see. It's uncanny to me that Democrats have an opportunity when they can communicate a message and stay on that point so much that ultimately the media and a large group of people will ultimately believe it. And we will stand up as Republicans and list out all this data. I'm going to do it again. List out all this data and all this good information that refutes that fact. And oftentimes my colleagues from the other side of the aisle, all they have to do sometimes is stand up and say, this is a tax cut for the rich. And literally, that's the narrative that continues on. I resent and I would
hope that we could actually agree that the child tax credit is not a tax scam. That real wage growth, because this didn't create, the Tax Cut Jobs Act didn't create an enormous amount of inflation. It didn't create any. We were able to see real wage growth take place. You had a doubling of the standard deduction. Is that a a direct benefit to the wealthy? In fact, I'll ask the question, Mr. Missouri, asking the minority witness a question. Would you say that the standard deduction is a benefit to the wealthy? Would you also say that SALT, the way we address SALT, by saying what was the average across the country, state and local taxes and that deduction? Let's double it. And is that a benefit to the wealthy, what we did on SALT?
There are pros and cons to all these things, right? So if you take individual items, you can say they benefited high-income people or lower-income people. But Tax Cuts and Jobs Act had lots of moving parts.
Yeah, it's a very large piece of legislation.
So when you talk about the SALT deduction, you also largely repealed the alternative minimum tax. And many people who feel that they lost the deduction for their state and local taxes actually lost it under prior law through the alternative minimum tax.
Right. So don't disagree with any of that. And I'm trying to make a point here that
Do not buy solar panels until you hear what the government just announced. Did you know that the government...
So many provisions in the Tax Cut Jobs Act weren't just this benefit to the wealthy. And I think it's a disingenuous narrative, but this place is what it is. I get it. And I would like to just, with my remaining time that I used way too much, focus on just one last thing. We have the R&D tax credit. To Mr. McBride, the R&D tax credit. Can we look at that and say, this is something we've got to preserve and work together? Would you suggest that Congress try to work together on a bipartisan way to make this happen, so we can make sure that we can write off these expenses in that first year?
Well, you mentioned R&D credit. I think you mean R&D expensing. That's the item.
R&D expenses, yes.
Is now expired, and we're now faced with the first time ever in this tax code we've had for 100 years, where businesses are required to wait for those deductions, and so I'm going to figure out how to amortize R&D expenses, which are primarily labor expenses, about 70%. So this is, paying scientists and stuff like this.
Sadly, the executive has expired. More sadly, they called one of these pesky annoying votes that just disrupt the schedule and are just very annoying. But there it is. It'll probably be about, I think there are 3 votes scheduled, so it'll might be about 30, 35 minutes or so. So I'll go out and get a cup of coffee or whatever, and apologize for that, but it's an occupational hazard of this job. We're all going to go vote. You go out to coffee, and we'll all come back in about a half hour. So thanks. Committee stands in recess.
Members of the committee from both sides of the aisle, so we're going to reconvene here. Committee will come to order. And now, Mr. Scott, I know you're getting yourself situated, so I don't want to start the clock on you. He's walking up here, ladies and gentlemen, of the upper deck. He is going to take full control of the ranking member's chair, and let's hope he doesn't drive us into the ditch like Brendan Boyles has done too many times. This is what you get as an open mic when everybody else is gone. Yeah, so feel free to pick on a few of my guys that aren't here.
Well, I'll pick on, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ranking member Scott, the floor is yours. I yield 5 minutes for your questions and answers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I hope put us in the ditch like every Republican president since Nixon has done. Every Republican administration since Nixon has left for their Democratic successors a worse deficit than they inherited. Every Democrat administration since Kennedy has left for their Republican successors a better deficit situation than they inherited. President Trump was on the way to doing that before the pandemic. President Biden is doing that already. So, Mr. Mazur, we've heard about inflation and why President has the United States inflation rate compared to the rest of the world.
Generally, the U.S. inflation rate is lower than developed countries like in Europe.
We've got a global inflation problem, and we're actually doing better than most.
Relatively better, yeah.
Mr. Mazur, do tax cuts affect the budget?
By arithmetic, yes, they affect the budget.
Well, some don't apparently believe in simple arithmetic like adding and subtracting, because you know that the under PAYGO that Democrats have as a budget rule. If you have new spending, you have to pay for it with either new taxes or the spending cuts. You got to pay for it. If you have a tax cut, you got to pay for it. Either raise somebody else's taxes or spending cuts to pay for it. Under the Republican plan, if you have a new spending plan, you have to pay for it. But if you have a tax cut, you don't have to pay for it. As if they didn't understand what you just said. And it's simple arithmetic. So, we've heard about taxing policy. Different tax cuts or different spending initiatives can stimulate the economy, but on a differential basis. Isn't it true that reducing taxes on dividends has a negligible effect on as a stimulus in the economy?
Yeah, I would think that relative to other potential tax cuts, given who the owners of shares are, giving them a lower tax rate probably doesn't boost the economy that much, and probably doesn't change corporate behavior that much.
And you said compared to other tax cuts, like what?
Well, if you're thinking you want to boost consumption, then you'd probably want to provide resources to people who are going to consume those tax cuts, so lower income and middle income.
Like the child tax credit?
Child tax credit would be one example, and I think you saw when it was a refundable credit paid monthly, that it had a pretty substantial benefit to the recipient family.
And the earned income tax credit?
Earned income tax credit is similar, though one caveat on the earned income tax credit is that for many years the earned income tax credit has been used as a replacement for increasing the minimum wage. Or just say, we're not going to increase the minimum wage, we're going to give you a tax credit instead. That works for the people who are eligible for the tax credit, but not those who don't have qualified children living in it.
In certain spending, it will have the same thing, like if you increase unemployment benefits, it will have a very good stimulus, or food stamps, increase that. That would go right back to the economy.
Fairly true.
So we know which tax policies work and which ones don't work. Who basically benefited from the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, known as the Trump tax scam?
Well, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed in 2017 had lots of moving parts. Basically, 2/3 of people in the country probably got a tax cut. The tax benefits for corporations were generally permanent. The tax benefits for individuals were generally temporary. I think there was a slightly larger proportional benefit to higher income people, in part because they benefit from the corporate tax cuts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You, Mac. Thank my new ranking member. And now you have 5 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Rothman.
I got 10 questions you got to answer quick. We didn't get all we wanted in our tax cut, or I didn't. And one of my concerns was I thought the purpose of the tax cut was to a degree to make us more competitive with countries abroad. And there are segments of the population that are more important than other segments. Manufacturing was always treated special in this country through a special credit. That disappeared with the tax cut. We only have so much money to pay for tax cuts. Somebody doing enough money to pay for any more tax cuts. But do you have a problem if we target it at manufacturing, which has to compete with other countries abroad? And maybe if we have to target it even more, the machines that are used in the factory to make other machines. I compliment the manufacturers all the time. There's always very important machines, printing, that sort of thing. Where do they make that machine? It's always Germany, Italy, Belgium, Korea, or Japan. do you think there is a problem with targeting the tax cut to those manufacturers as opposed to, say, retail, which is going to be here anyway?
I'll take that one. I have a problem with that. I mean, I think targeting manufacturing is, first of all, not a very small target. Right? Manufacturing is a huge sector. There was a manufacturing deduction years ago.
Before we got rid of it, it was a
That's
manufacturing
correct.
credit.
And it was taken by all sorts of taxpayers, including publishers, coffee makers, stuff like this. So manufacturing is just a huge sector. And the other thing is that I agree that they are subject to to competition from abroad. There are other sectors. There's lots of mobility in a lot of sectors.
Okay.
I suggest
I'm going to cut you off.
lowering the corporate rate.
I'm going to cut you off a little bit. There is an economic argument, if you are solely concerned in the short term, that one business is the same as another business. I thought we saw a little in the COVID that there are some businesses that are more important for our national security and for our wealth, which is why I wondered about targeting manufacturing as opposed to retail or, say, law offices. Did anyone of you want to comment on that at all? I mean, we used to treat manufacturing better.
Yeah, so it's possible that you could make an argument that for national security purposes, certain types of production should be in the United States. But I don't think that the tax code is a good tool to accomplish that. I think the tax system should be primarily used to raise revenue in a neutral manner. But if there are national security concerns, that should be dealt with elsewhere.
You can tell me how later, but okay, next question we have. We are sometimes criticized for having our tax cuts favor the rich. That's inevitable, I think, because the poor don't pay the tax in the first place. But I do think we'd be good after credits that purely are benefiting the wealthy. One of those is carried interest. Does anyone want to say that we should get rid of carried interest? You can do it if our guys want.
No, you should. I think this is an area where basically it's ordinary compensation to people in various businesses, and it's treated in a preferential way.
Yeah, we're helping the hyper wealthy with a different tax treatment. Well, thank you. Any of our guys agree with that? Our guys in the left.
I agree with that.
Okay, we'll try to do that. I'll give you another one. Section 42, low income housing. That is, you're giving some guy or gal 85, 95% of the value of a new building if they rent to low income people. It offends me out of my mind because you have this group of people who probably gives a lot of money up here too, who are getting wildly generous tax cuts. Maybe they sell these credits to other businesses. You feel that's something we should get rid of, or is that, I mean, just saying, they're just overwhelmingly benefit very wealthy developers. Want to comment on getting rid of that?
I think the important thing to recognize is that is pretty much the only low-income housing project.
So you don't think we can, first of all, low-income housing isn't a federal problem. It's a state problem. But you don't think there's any way to get money for housing for poor people other than to, in essence, give very wealthy developers?
No. If you want to do it through a spending side program, it could be way more targeted, way better targeted than it is. But Congress decided to do it through the tax code. And as Kyle has said, the tax code's a very blunt tool.
Any of the other guys? I hate Section 42 more than anything. That's why I bring it up. Will any one of you guys say it's wrong? It's not good to make the wealthiest of developers wildly more wealthy. That's the only way we.
Yeah, I say it's wrong. I mean, I probably say that. It's wrong in the same way that targeting speculative provision is wrong. I mean, the general principle is that you want to do. And so this thing for low-income housing should go in favor of lowering rates generally for all.
I guess I'm up. I can talk there. Okay.
No, well,
They cut me off. Okay.
The gentleman's time's expired. Appreciate his comments and questions. I'll now yield 5 minutes to my friend Dan Kildee from Michigan.
Thank you. if you're 45 and older and live in the United States and you still don't have life insurance, we're going to show you how easy it is to apply for up to $1 million in coverage with no physical exam and no face-to-face meeting requirement. Even if you have health conditions or you're a smoker, click the blue button below this video.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and to temporary ranking member Scott. Good to see you. Listening to my friend from Wisconsin, it's obvious that there are some areas where we have significant disagreement, but interestingly enough, some areas where we might find agreement when it comes to tax policy. So I do think it would make sense for us as a body, and I serve on the Ways and Means Committee, the Tax Writing Committee, trying to focus on tax policy that is a bipartisan approach. It's very difficult to do, I acknowledge it, but if we're going to have sustainable policy, we're going to have to figure out a way to do this in a bipartisan fashion that ensures that people and organizations pay their fair share, and that the obligations for those who have significant resources are applied to them. And also that we do have incentives built into the code. Now, we can argue about whether or not we do a direct spend approach or we use the tax code as a way to get at it as a blunt instrument. But I don't think we can deny that there are priorities that are federal priorities that we ought to focus on. I do believe that housing, a fundamental aspect of the hierarchy of human needs, ought to be on the agenda for the federal government. And whatever method we want to use to get at it, I'm interested in a conversation on that. But I think, unfortunately, what we've seen most recently in the legislation that House Republicans have advanced doesn't meet those tests. It doesn't substantially cut taxes for working families. It certainly doesn't deal with some of the needs of the most at-risk people that we face. We've had conversations about the low-income individuals, and some of the conversations about the child tax credit that would make it into the legislation. Instead, it overwhelmingly would cut taxes for the largest and wealthiest corporations. So it's not a fiscally responsible approach. It increases our deficits and exacerbates the inequities in the tax code. Obviously, we may not all agree on that particular point, but I think any thoughtful analysis of the Republican plan would cause that conclusion to be drawn. We saw, for example, as a result of Republican tax legislation in 2020, 55 of the largest Fortune 500 companies don't pay federal taxes. I don't think anybody can defend that when those organizations and high wealth individuals pay less in federal income taxes than a teacher in my communities of Bay City or a nurse in Saginaw or a factory worker in Midland. So I'm disappointed in that. But Mr. Mazur, I wonder if you might just take a moment to comment on the economic and fiscal benefits of first cutting taxes for workers and middle income families to grow the economy, and second, making sure that those large corporations and wealthy individuals pay more, just to be blunt, more meaning their fair share, in order to reduce our deficit. I mean, it's a fundamental question, but that really is the question before us.
No, let's start the second part. Basically, if you have a set of goods and services that the federal government is providing, you should find a way to pay for them. And the system that we have in place does not raise an adequate amount of revenue to meet that. So you need to find. And you're right to focus on large corporations who are paying small amounts of tax, and high-income individuals who similarly pay less tax than folks further down the income distribution. That'd be the first place to start. I guess in terms of tax cuts, I put that a little bit aside before you got the fiscal house in order. Tax cuts are not going to be a driving force for making the economy work better. Right? You want to have a good labor force, good infrastructure, well-educated population, and so on. Tax cuts are sort of secondary to that.
But in that context, though, when I think about tax obligations, if you could just briefly address the economic impact of, say, for instance, the refundable child tax credit.
So refundable child tax credit, we saw this occur when it was paid on a monthly basis. We saw it improve the life situations of the recipients significantly. And so that's a situation where getting additional money into those pockets of those people was a good thing. Whether the tax code has to do that or some other way is a discussion. I mean, I'd be much more in favor of increasing the minimum wage than increasing the child tax credit by a similar amount.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate this conversation. Obviously, we have a lot of work to do, but I would like to pursue some areas of common ground. Mr. Grothman made a mention of a particular tax provision that I think we all could maybe have a conversation about. I appreciate the fact that the witnesses at least share some common ground when it comes to that subject. With that, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Michigan and yield 5 minutes to my friend Rudy Yakum from Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to submit into the record a report from the Heritage Foundation titled "The Tax Cuts and Job Act's 12 Myths Debunked."
So moved.
Thank you. And thank you to our witnesses for being here today to share your expertise on this critical issue. It's no secret that state and federal tax policies strongly impact economic growth and opportunities for all Americans. Every tax dollar that the IRS collects is a dollar that hardworking families don't get to put towards food on the table or a night out at the movies. And it's a dollar that businesses don't get to put towards raises for their employees or capital expenditures. Repeatedly, we've seen the positive impact of tax cuts on everyday Americans. For example, in the 2 years after the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, real median household income increased by over $5,000. Yet President Biden and congressional Democrats continue to push for higher taxes and spending with complete disregard for the impact on inflation, the impact on long-term economic growth, and the impact on American and even more specifically Hoosier families and businesses. The American Rescue Plan, which was ran through without a single Republican vote, supercharged inflation, saddled everyday Americans and small businesses and small business owners with burdensome new paperwork requirements on transactions over $600.
Car Gurus. Shop, buy, sell online.
The Inflation Reduction Act, which was also ran through without a single Republican vote, imposed American manufacturers with over $100 billion in new taxes. Meanwhile, the Biden administration's loose regulatory interpretations have ballooned the cost of new tax credits to over 700% of their original projected cost. What we should be focused on is how to incentivize growth, how to incentivize more research and more development within the United States. For example, a study published in the Journal of Public Economics estimated that when a business received a 10% reduction in their R&D costs, they increased research spending by intensity by about 19.8%. Additionally, they found that most of the increased spending went to increases in wages and supplies. This clearly illustrates the broad benefits in allowing businesses to expense or receive tax credits for research and development. So my question for Mr. McBride to start, can you speak to the economic impact of R&D tax credits and deductions on everyday Americans?
Sure. So this gets to the discussion we were having earlier about consumption being a driver of the economy. It's true that consumption is about 70% of GDP, for instance, but as investment, what happens first? You get consumption. Investment creates the income, ultimately, out of which you consume. And so it's investment that should be prioritized here, and that's what we should be discussing here. And it is R&D investment in particular that is incentivized by R&D expensing. So yes, it's a very, very important provision.
And how would that help everyday Americans or even Hoosiers that, just median income Hoosiers?
So it leads to greater R&D expenditures. R&D leads to innovation. Innovation leads to better products, better consumer products, more efficiencies in the workplace, which in turn leads to higher productivity, ultimately. The workers are paid based on their productivity, so that means higher wages.
Estimates by the Keto Institute show that, quote, if Congress confiscated every dollar earned by individuals and businesses passed their first $500,000, it would still be about $200 billion short of covering the cost of next year's projected $1.7 trillion deficit. Mr. McBride, do you believe that this shows that we have a spending problem or a revenue problem in Washington?
I think the clearest picture is from the CBO, and they simply do their 10-year projection. Looking forward, they're showing on average spending is going to be about 24% GDP over the next 10 years.
Is this $3 AI wonder stock thanks Microsoft? According to CNBC, if you invested in Microsoft back in 1986, when they first went public, and stayed invested, your $1,000 investment will be worth nearly $2.5 million now. Well, guess what Bill Gates has said about AI? He believes that the company who masters AI will be worth at least 10 Microsofts. So take that $2.5 million and multiply it by 10.
That's about 3 to 4 percentage points higher than the historic average. Okay, and then we have revenues also higher than the historic average, coming in about 18%. So I think that is all you need to know going forward. If it's spending or revenues that are the problem.
Thank you. And Mr. Mazur, part of my job is ensuring that Hoosiers and small businesses and families don't pay higher taxes. And that's a result of Washington's overspending. And in your opening testimony, you stated and complained that you now pay less taxes today as a percentage of what you did prior. So I just want to make sure that you're aware that the Treasury Department actually has a program where if you don't feel like you're paying enough taxes, you can send in additional dollars, and that would help make sure that my constituents don't bear the cost of the overspending here in Washington. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm well aware of that program. I also don't have a Roth IRA for a similar reason, that I enjoy paying my taxes because, like they say, taxes are the price you pay for civil rights.
Thank the gentleman from Indiana, and now yield 5 minutes to my colleague from Oklahoma, Josh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I heard earlier today one of our colleagues, one of our Democrat colleagues, I wrote down the comment. They were concerned about, quote, a proliferation of billionaires in our country. Exact quote from what they said. They were also concerned, quote, that we have as the United States, quote, the highest number of billionaires in the world. It made me think about John F. Kennedy and his famous commentary that a rising tide lifts all ships, all boats, and how this ideology of wanting to weaken our country's ability to have people invest and create jobs, how it's taken over and it misuses facts. I greatly enjoyed studying the Tax Foundation state-by-state comparisons. And with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, what we know is the corporate income tax rate, which made America have among the highest corporate income taxes in the world, with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we went back to the average. And then last year, if you look at the 2022 income tax collections, what you find is that the top 1% paid 42% of all income taxes. And the top 50% paid 97% of income earners, paid 97% of all income taxes. And the bottom income earners of the United States only paid 2.3% of all income taxes. So it's amazing to me the rhetoric that continues to come out when we already have 7 graduated tax rates. We're totally in contrast to what in the 1935s William John Henry Bocher once said: you can't help the poor man by destroying the rich man. You can't strengthen the weak by weakening the strong. You can't lift the wage earner up by pulling the wage payer down. It's just an astounding contrast in America that we don't want to create an environment that makes people successful. And then when you actually look at who's paying taxes, as I just recited, it doesn't match the rhetoric of we got to get them to pay more. So, you made a comment about vertical equity. You defined it a minute ago about vertical equity is to get those who do better to pay more. With 97% of the income tax burden paid by the highest 50% of earners, and the bottom 50% of earners pay only 2.3%. And the top 1% that's talked about all the time pay 42% of all income taxes. And we're at the average of corporate income tax rates. And you look at where we're at historically in terms of our gross domestic product and the amount of tax collection, and we're on par with history of our nation.
can you explain to me where do you expect people to pay more when we have the system already in place?
Sure. So you're focused on income taxes. If you go back to your constituents, probably more than half of them pay way more in payroll taxes than income tax. And you're leaving payroll taxes out of the calculation here when you're going through who pays how much.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Payroll taxes, you're talking about FICA and
Social Security, Medicare.
Yeah, Medicare. Yeah. So what we know by looking at that is that when we look at our budget deficits, our annual budget deficits of 1.5 trillion this year, that's not inclusive of the insolvency of those programs you're discussing. Most of us, we know we've got to solve that problem. But that's a totally different conversation the way we're looking at budgets.
That's totally different. It's part of the entire fiscal package.
Of unfunded obligations, I agree with you there.
And you're right that you know how to solve this. There's like 6 dials you can turn. And you can get the Ways and Means Committee together to figure out how you want to address Social Security, whether you want to do something on the benefit side, the tax side, the retirement aid side, cost of living side. There aren't that many dials.
Can I pivot one?
Sure, please.
I just need to pivot because of limited time here. I want to go back to something that it was part of your introductory testimony where you talked about the ability for us as a nation to look at a simplification of our tax code. We have about $100 billion expense to just pay our taxes in the United States. And the Tax Foundation has got some ideas. And I want to give you just a moment to talk about Estonia, what they're doing to simplify within minutes to be able to file your taxes. And, what we can learn, what I love about what the Tax Foundation has done state by state comparison, helps states get an idea of how you can improve the ability to find out what's working and look at the laboratories of experimentation, laboratories of democracy state by state, but also by looking at different countries. I'd like to have you speak in my time limit here. 20 seconds. If you can talk about Estonia.
20 seconds. I think some people in Estonia might actually file their taxes in 20 seconds. The claim there is that you can file your taxes in 5 minutes or less. We have talked, my friend Kyle here, we have talked to the folks in Estonia at the Ministry of Finance, and they confirmed that indeed it's 5 minutes or less to file your taxes, which should be mind-blowing for Americans. But they do it because they have a very simple system, that actually collects plenty of revenue.
It's not 72,000 pages when you look at court cases like the United States.
It's about 88 pages, the entire federal tax code. So it can be done.
Mr. Chairman, I yield. Thank you for your indulgence.
You bet. I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma. Now you have 5 minutes to my friend from North Carolina, Chuck Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Mazur, I heard you mention something a while ago that seems to be a typical political talking point. That is, there are corporations in America that do not pay any taxes. Do you think they're doing anything illegal?
Taking advantage of the tax incentives that are provided, whether they, Mr. Crawford was talking about some of the tax credits that they have available or the deductions that they have available.
And so do you think that's wrong, that they take advantage of people?
So Congress used to have an alternative minimum tax for corporations, and part of the reason for having an alternative minimum tax was that it provided a backstop. It said, no matter how many deductions or credits you get.
Mr. Mazur, thank you for that. Have you ever paid alternative minimum tax? And you recognize that the reason that one would pay that is because there was no income in the first place. I mean,
that's true. I paid alternative minimum tax personally, but my income was probably around $200,000 a year, similar to your income. And it was because I had a lot of state and local taxes that are not allowed as a deduction under the alternative minimum tax.
I can tell you as a business person, I've paid lots of alternative minimum in tax, and it's because there was no income. And I believe that's what is the case with most businesses out there today. The goal of every business is to have income to be able to pay taxes. Would you not also agree that even those companies that do not generate income to the level to pay the income taxes that you might want them to pay, do pay Social Security taxes? They do pay FICA taxes. They do pay property taxes. They do pay unemployment taxes. There's still plenty of taxes out there for those companies that have not generated the income to pay. You do recognize
it. Pay a whole range of taxes.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Farmerlow,
TCGA reduced the federal corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. What did that do for international competitiveness?
So, as I described in my testimony, prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the U.S. had the highest statutory tax rate in the developed world, and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act brought that down to roughly about average. That had a couple of benefits sort of internationally. So the first one is that it reduced the incentive for corporations to locate their profits in low tax jurisdictions. The amount a company can save depends on the differential in tax rates. And when the U.S. had very high tax rate and other jurisdictions had lower rates, companies could save more by shifting overseas. And the second benefit is it also reduced the incentive to locate intellectual property offshore as well. When a company is deciding where to place a highly mobile asset, they're going to ask themselves, all right, where can I get the highest after-tax return on this investment? And a lot of that is determined by the statutory tax rate that the U.S. levies. Bringing that down also sort of
As any CEO would do, they're trying to generate income for their shareholders, their owners. And so I appreciate you calling attention to the fact that if we want more American jobs, if we want more investment in the United States, as opposed to places like China, then we need to create the environment for them to do that. Thank you very much. Mr. Kuhlman, what did the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 do for small businesses?
I think from an overall environment, the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act combined with some of the emphasis on reducing regulations, we saw small business optimism at or near all-time highs right before the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic turned everything upside down. But business owners took the benefits and just reinvested it back in the business. According to a survey we did in 2019, 1 in 4 increased compensation, nearly identical number increased business investment, 16% hired new employees, 20% paid down debt. Overall, they plowed it back into the business or their obligations for the overall economic benefit.
Thank you. One more question I'd like to get to before I run out of time. 32% of small business owners reported raising their selling prices. Would raising taxes help the inflation that Americans are already experiencing today?
Short answer, no.
Okay. All right. Mr. Chair, I see I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from North Carolina and yield 5 minutes to my friend Lloyd Smucker from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Thank you to the chairman. Mr. Mazur, sorry about that. In response to a question earlier, you said we could make the tax system more fair by making it progressive.
It already is progressive, making it more progressive.
Okay. That's the point I wanted to clarify. In fact, I'd like to enter into the record a report from the Joint Committee on Taxation, Mr. Chairman.
So ordered.
This is from 2018. And this report identifies the U.S. tax system as the most progressive in the developed world. Do you agree? Generally?
I'm not going to quarrel with JCT since I used to work there.
Okay, yeah. So I think it's important we establish that, because if I had listened to your answer and not had more context, I'd thought that the individuals on the lower economic scale are paying higher percentage and lower. But I'll give you some numbers in here.
Okay.
And your point of excluding payroll taxes is a good one, because they pay payroll taxes. But without payroll taxes, the bottom 50% are paying minus 0.6%, minus 0.6.
In that year,
what's that?
In that year, perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, minus 0.6. Because of the refundable tax credit, they're literally getting money back rather than paying it. That's the bottom 50%. Now, with payroll taxes, to your point, their average rate, according to JCT, is 6.3%, compared to the top 0.1% are paying on average 33% of their taxes. So it's the most
Interestingly, though, if you were to break that top 10 even finer, so like the Treasury Department used to put out the top 400, and now they're maybe the top 0.01%. But basically, the top sliver pays less than the top 1%. So it kind of goes down at the top end.
They don't have that on here, but, I'm willing to look at that. That'd be interesting. But one of the statistics that they list on here is that the top 0.01%, top tenth of a percent pay 30% average federal income tax rate. I'm sorry, I just made this point. While the bottom 50% is less than zero. Here's the point I wanted. Separate research, and this is from the Tax Policy Center, which is sort of a liberal. Okay, yeah, you worked it all out. They say research that the top 1% of income earners shoulder 25% of all federal taxes paid. In contrast to 53 million households in the U.S. that pay nothing at all. In fact, 6 out of 10 households actually receive more in direct government benefits than they pay into the system. Again, just want to be sure that we understand what we're working with here. And the point about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act making the system benefit more for higher income earners is false. Because CBO in 2021, and I'd like to enter this into the record as well. This is 2021 report by CBO, and they state that the provisions of the 2017 Tax Act reduced the total estimate of benefits from income tax expenditures by 9%. And on net, those provisions made the distribution of tax expenditures more progressive because most of the benefits reduced by the Tax Act would have accrued to households in highest quintile. So we started with the most progressive, according to JCT, of developed countries, and we made it even more progressive with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
I'm gonna have to quarrel with CBO on that. You might want to look at the Tax Policy Center's work that was done on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I think they come to a somewhat different conclusion. And it really depends on the time frame you look at.
Sure.
It depends on because the individual ones expire, and it depends on who you incorporate.
Yeah, I'm just telling you what CBO said in their report. They said that our tax structure got more progressive after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But Mr. Coleman, I was a small business owner, so I understand the impact of tax policy and the benefits of growing a business. And I've heard from so many small businesses in my area who benefited from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I'm not talking about the top 1% or top 10%. I'm talking about people who maybe they had 10,000 more in their pocket at the end of the year that they could reinvest back into the business, grow jobs, and so on. And just wonder what are the top provision that you hear about? What are some of the things that you hear about that have been most beneficial? And then how concerned are you about some of those provisions expiring?
Sure. Yeah, the what we call the small business deduction, Section 199A, the 20% deduction for pass-through businesses, it had a great benefit for small business owners, NFIB members. 91% of our support is permanent, 81% is very important. And just a quick example is a Pennsylvania business owner, David Cranston Jr. of Cranston Material Handling Corporation, who said it is only a couple employees, but he said in real terms, this means I will be able to keep between $1,200 and $2,500 a quarter in my business that I would otherwise have paid in taxes. The ability to keep $5,000 or $10,000 in a year in my company is a big deal to a small business owner like me. Moreover, the cumulative effect over several years is substantial. They allowed him and millions of other businesses like him to be in a better position to take advantage of opportunities to grow and improve. They're going to
thank you. I know I'm way out of time. Thank you for your indulgence.
Go from thumping to gaveling.
Sorry about that.
Thank you, Mr. Rucker. And now we will yield 5 minutes to Dr. Michael Burgess from the great state of Texas.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Actually, let me start with the unanimous consent request for two documents, one being the Democrats corporate automobiles manufacturers, second, Chinese Communist Party linked solar panel company could reap Inflation Reduction Act handouts with U.S. factory.
So ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Staying with the Inflation Reduction Act for just a minute. We created two new corporate taxes. Mr. McBride, two new corporate taxes were created in the Inflation Reduction Act. 26 tax credit programs on top of an already complex and burdensome tax code. So I think your colleagues at the Tax Foundation has estimated that over $300 billion a year is lost in productivity due to the complexity of the United States tax code. So every Congress that I have been here, I have introduced HR 1040. This is a flat tax, a version of the same flat tax that was created by my predecessor, Peter Army, when he was here. And honestly, I mean, you referenced the Estonia tax code and how people can file their taxes in under 5 minutes. And wouldn't reducing the complexity of the tax code and perhaps flattening the rate a little bit, would that not have a positive effect on people's compliance with the tax code as well as overall tax collections?
Absolutely would. So the real world examples we have, not just in Estonia, but a lot of their neighbors in Eastern Europe, that's where flat taxes really took off in the 90s. Many countries there implemented flat taxes. And they did so because, one reason, they were having a big compliance problem. They were having all sorts of, major tax evasion with a complicated income tax like ours. So they came upon a solution, which is to simplify the rules, flatten the tax, toss out all the special provisions, and lo and behold, they found it generated better compliance and more stable and reliable revenues over the years. And so they stuck with those flat taxes, and Estonia went further, and eventually with their business tax, they simplified it even further to this distributed profits tax. There's basically no taxable income. There's no calculation of taxable income at all. Instead, it's just a tax on whatever is distributed to shareholders. Taxing one stream rather than calculating all of the items of income and all items of expense, et cetera, and sending it to the tax authorities.
Well, it's a practical matter. They suffered from not bringing.
Can you say that again?
As a practical matter, has Estonia suffered from not bringing in enough tax revenue?
No, absolutely not. They generate revenues today, 20 years into this new system, that have essentially are pretty typical across the developed world in terms of income tax collections.
So, just my own observation, living and working in this country in 1986 when the Reagan tax cuts were introduced and passed, Bush tax cuts in 2004, and Chairman Brady's tax reform in 2017. My observation is you seem to have an increase in compliance. You didn't have to hire 87,000 new IRS agents, but you make things more straightforward and people comply because it was easier to comply than it was to hide your income and try to not comply. Is that a valid assumption?
It's absolutely valid. When we have a tax code today, there's 4 million words. I don't think any person on earth has the ability to understand something like that.
Mr. Chairman, in the time I have remaining, I'm going to have another unanimous consent request. It also deals with the Inflation Reduction Act. This is a page from the Federal Register from October 14, 2022, from the Department of Health and Human Services, and reports the establishment of the Medicare Drug Rebate Negotiation Group within the Center for Medicare. Most people did not realize that with the act, the federal government will now have the largest and most secretive PBM that has ever been developed. Now, a lot of us decry the PBM because we say they only add complexity and they don't bring anything of value to the system. When you read through these words in the Federal Register, it absolutely describes a nightmare going forward. And of course, their enforcement mechanism is the tax code, a 1,900% tax on any gross revenues that the company may may create. So, Mr. Chairman, this is a very serious matter, and we haven't talked about it enough, but I do want to introduce this for the record, and perhaps at some point in the future, we can have a hearing on the deleterious effects on the what's happening in the United States with the so-called mislabeled Inflation Reduction Act.
I thank the gentleman from Texas, so ordered, and now yield 5 minutes to my friend from Virginia, Mr. Bob Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. I think you're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel here. I appreciate your investment time today. I wanted to touch, with the limited time that we have, on a couple of the president or the administration's key policy priorities, energy or climate, as well as immigration/border and how they impact the economy. A couple of questions to Mr. McBride first. Mr. McBride, the president has stated many times that his proposed tax reforms would help average Americans. How would you reconcile that or contrast that, I suppose, perhaps, with the 80% of the electric vehicle tax credits are going to households 100,000 or higher?
Well, clearly that is, like you describe and like anybody can recognize, when you look at the sticker prices on electric vehicles, that those are luxury goods. They are not targeting a low-income community with those products. Those are luxury goods that, as good as they are for the planet, perhaps, they are very expensive. They have been expensive for ever since they've been produced. And so these tax credits, of course, then go to high-income individuals that can afford a $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, up to $80,000 is what is allowed under these new tax credits. It's the sticker price of an electric vehicle. Then there's a loophole around that, and so that around that provision and then the income provision. So that is the leasing loophole. And so none of the restrictions, as I understand it, apply to vehicles, electric vehicles that are leased. You get the credit that flows through the leasing company to the consumer. So, someone making millions of dollars a year, for instance, if they lease an electric vehicle, benefit from the credit that way.
Yeah, it's really just a thing that we would have the tax credit. And then if we're trying to force Americans to electric reduction of gas-powered vehicles, what's going to happen to the prices of gas-powered vehicles as their supply is limited? What is it? We can all imagine and speculate what that would do. I also, consistent with what you said, reports I've read are that vast majority of electric vehicle owners use their luxury. It is a secondary vehicle because of the impractical nature of it. It's impractical, insufficient number of charging stations, impractical for long distance travel, that sort of thing. The Biden energy agenda more broadly, combined with the massive inflationary spending, combined with the response, I would suggest a misguided response of massively raising interest rates. So the housing prices are up, inflation is up, grocery prices are up, utility prices are up, gas prices are up. So let's sock the American people with higher interest rates to make it so they can't afford to buy homes, but we make the average cost of a mortgage go up about 50%. So your thoughts on how is this doubling down on his Green New Deal tax credits? How's that going to impact the economic growth?
Well, I think it was sold as an Inflation Reduction Act, of course, that's the title. That was all premised on the idea that it would reduce deficits, which was what was originally thought based on the original score. We now know that the score was off. It was off in the direction of actually underestimating the cost of these green credits greatly. And so now, based on the new scores from JCT, it appears the IRA legislation as a whole increases deficits. It's not clear how much. We should hopefully get a new score for the entire bill to find that out. But if there's no deficit reduction in this bill, then there goes the idea that it reduces inflation.
Mr. Pomelo, with the limited time that we have, I saw a study that says the net cost of illegal immigration in the United States, 16 million or more illegals in the country now is about 150 billion last year, roughly $9,000 per illegal. Could you speak to the cost to the American taxpayer for the flow of illegals?
Thanks for your question, but this is a little outside of my area of expertise. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on this issue in particular.
Well, they're very, I'll just show those seconds I got left. It's funny, we have a law in this country where if legal immigrants can't be on the public dole, but illegal immigrants, if you break the law, your first act on the floor of the United States, if you break the law, then we give you all the social safety nets, the social welfare, the health care, the social services that we can provide to you. So it's really,
I think the gentleman from Virginia yield 5 minutes, I think, to close out our hearing. My friend Buddy Carter from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of y'all for being here. And I promise you we'll be brief and try to get through this 5 minutes as quickly as we can. But I want to ask you, our current tax code, and I think most people would agree, it's built on government control, and it's built on trying to control actions of people and what they do. I've served in a number of different capacities. I've been a mayor, I've been a state legislator, and now I serve in Congress. I started when I was 10, so that explains that. But nevertheless, I've always noticed that people, given the choice between a property tax or an income tax, that they don't like taxes, but given that choice, they would prefer a consumption tax. Are you familiar? Any of you familiar with the fair tax? Can you tell me? I'm the sponsor of the fair tax. The fair tax was started in the late 90s by John Linder, and then Rob Woodall, who was his chief of staff at the time, became a member after John left. Rob took his place, and then when Rob left, he asked me if I would carry it, and I did, and I'm proud to. It was the very first bill that I sponsored when I became a member of Congress. And tell me, if you will, what you think about a consumption tax and about specifically the fair tax in that proposal.
So I think consumption taxes are good policy. I think that in general, they are less distortive than the income tax. They do not discourage investment. They do not discourage saving. If they're structured well, they can reduce non-compliance in the tax system. The fair tax in particular, I think the policy heart is in the right place, but I think structurally.
Well, what would you change? Tell me, how can I make it better?
So I think the fundamental weakness of the fair tax is that it's a retail sales tax. I think retail sales taxes, they're collected all at the very last point in the chain of production at the retailer. And as a result, all the revenue is collected at that point, which creates a pretty significant incentive to avoid tax, especially if the rate is high enough to replace current revenues. And I actually have a recent paper that I did that estimated how high the tax rate would need to be under the fair tax to replace.
And what did you come up with?
And with a reasonable amount of avoidance, which I think might be.
And do you think we have any avoidance in the current tax system?
The current tax code does have avoidance, but I think any tax system has avoidance.
But you think that the fair tax would have more avoidance?
Well, in our paper, we assume that it would have just the same amount as the current tax
fair enough.
system.
Fair enough.
The tax rate would have to be in the high 30% in order to cover current tax rate. So at a rate that high, I think a retail sales tax.
And what do we have it at? In the proposal, do you know what it's at?
So in the proposal, you have two rates. You have a standard rate and a variable rate for the trust funds, and those in the first year add up to a tax inclusive rate of 23%.
Right.
The tax exclusive rate is closer to 29 or 30%.
Right.
But that would be insufficient to cover current revenues. Plus,
how do you base that assumption on that it would be inconsistent?
Sorry.
How do you base that consumption to be inconsistent to replace what we currently have in revenue?
So we did our estimates based on national accounts. So this was using BEA data and IRS data.
Okay, let me cut to the chase. What would you do differently? How would you improve it?
So I think so.
Because would you agree, first of all, people prefer a consumption tax and then people would have control?
I would prefer a consumption tax.
And this would give people control as opposed to the government having control.
So I think that one of the weaknesses is that you're resting the entire tax code on a single tax, which can create problems with avoidance. I think having multiple taxes is good. Second, I think you can improve.
You might be alone in that.
I think you can improve over a retail sales tax with a value-added tax. Under a value-added tax, you'd be collecting the same amount as under a retail sales tax, but it would be done each stage in the production process. So if there's avoidance, it only ends up being a small amount of avoidance.
All right. Anybody else want to comment real quick? I'm sorry.
I agree with those comments. I'll just add further what the VAT does has a bad reputation because it comes from Europe.
Yes.
But what you're doing makes a lot of sense, which is removing the cascading effect of sales taxes on business inputs as they go through production process.
Well, look,
sales tax.
I'm appealing to you. I won't help. I want to make this even better. So help me.
That's the best. The single best thing, in my view, that you could do to that is remove that cascading effect of taxes on business inputs.
Okay. All right. Well, we're hopefully going to be taking this up. So I need your help and I want your input. So I'm appealing to you to help me with that. Thank y'all. Appreciate it. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thoroughly enjoyed the dialogue and I appreciate the time of our witnesses. In closing, just a quick thought, and then I'm going to ask my ranking member to close it up. Our first hearing was about the fiscal stabilization. I don't think there was any disagreement that we've got problems, and those problems are getting worse very quickly. And that the financial health of the country is deteriorating. How we address that, I think there's definitely disagreement, but there's probably commonality as well. Today, we focused on one part of the equation, the revenue side, and the growth side. I appreciate that good, open, robust discussion and debate. Here's my biggest concern that gnaws at me in every committee hearing, and that is that we have 1.5% of the funding of our government that we borrow next of future generations of Americans, and it is completely unsustainable. And so you have colleagues on one side that may want to raise taxes or some combination, and you have people like me who think we need to massively right size and shrink the government, cut expenses, or some combination. But it is immoral, in my mind, to rack up this kind of debt and to stack it, shift it as a deferred tax on our children. And that's the unfortunate nature of the budget process, is that we just continue to perpetuate this to the demise, I think, of future generations. With that, Mr. Scott, bring us home.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think if we just pay for what we do, you can balance the budget. I think Mr. Meza pointed out that it's arithmetic. If you're going to have a new spending program, pay for it. And if tax cuts, just pay for it. And things won't get worse. And under Clinton, they got so much better. We were on course to paying off the entire national debt held by the public by 2008. Entire debt held by the public, and put all the money back in the trust funds by 2013. But you can't do it if you have unpaid spending or unpaid benefits. You got to pay for what you want to spend.
You know, I know this is not a common thing, but I actually agree with that. See, look here. I'm in the most Republican district in Texas. Whether you offset through a cut to pay for tax cuts, tax reform, or you raise revenue, because we rarely do, and we reach for the more expedient mechanism, which is finance it, which doesn't hurt anybody. You don't have to raise the tax, take any money out of anyone's wallet. We don't have to cut somebody's favorite program. When that happens, and we can still grow the government, there's not a real rational decision as to, do we really want that? Can we really afford that? So those trade-offs aren't there in this unfortunate, sort of fantastical system that we have today. If we had one that considered cost that we paid for it in one way or the other, I think we'd have a very different dynamic between the elected and representative leaders of our great country. That was, there you go. Yes, yes, yes. Get it back. Well, Mr. Scott, I'm going to invite you up here to the upper deck more often. I think we may have to have an executive session about the ranking member job since he's gone. I thank you, Dr. McBride, Mr. Pomerleau, Mr. Coolman, Dr. Mazer, is that right? For appearing before us today. Please be advised that members may submit the written questions to be answered later in writing. Questions and their answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any member who wishes to submit their questions to the record may do so within 7 days. With that, the committee stands adjourned.
To join this conversation. Last week, he sent me a letter declining to testify at today's hearing, and he said, quote, separation of powers concerns and the importance of preserving the judicial independence. The reality is that sitting justices have testified at 92 congressional hearings since 1960. And I even offered the Chief Justice the opportunity to designate someone else on the court to testify. But I'm more troubled by the suggestion that testifying to this committee would somehow infringe on the separation of powers or threaten judicial independence. In fact, answering legitimate questions for the people's elected representatives is one of the checks and balances that helps preserve the separation of powers. In his letter last week, the Chief Justice also sent what he called a statement of ethics, principles, and practices. It was a document that was attached to his letter. It is an extraordinary document, not in a good way. It makes clear that while the justices are fine with consulting with certain authorities on how to address ethical issues, they do not feel bound by those same authorities. Much of the document explains why justices think they should not be treated the same as other federal judges when it comes to ethics. And it stresses that recusal decisions are made by individual justices alone, with no review of their discretion. The Chief Justice's letter and statement of principles are in defense of the status quo, but they are oblivious to the obvious. Last month, we learned about a justice who for years has accepted lavish trips and real estate purchases worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from a billionaire with interest before the court. That justice failed to disclose these gifts and has faced no apparent consequences of the court's ethics principles. That justice claims that lengthy cruises aboard a luxury yacht are personal hospitality and are exempt under current ethical standards from even being reported. The fact that a Texas billionaire paid more than $100,000 for the justice's mother's home also seems to be an acceptable example because the justice insists that he lost money in the transaction. How low can the court go? One of our witnesses today is going to say that what I just described to you is hallucinating. I think it's pretty clear to most objective people this is not the ordinary course of business, nor should it be a standard for those of us in public service. We wouldn't tolerate this from a city council member or an alderman. It falls short of ethical standards we expect of any public servant in America. And yet the Supreme Court won't even acknowledge it's a problem. The Chief Justice's letter doesn't mention it. Meanwhile, the rest of the federal judiciary and the executive and legislative branches have codes of conduct designed to prevent even the appearance of fraud, abuse, or corruption. As this chart tells us, the Supreme Court is an outlier on the basics. This is untenable. Ethics cannot simply be left to the discretion of the nation's highest court. The court should have a code of conduct with clear and enforceable rules, so both justices and the American people know when conduct crosses the line. The highest court in the land should not have the lowest ethical standards. That reality is driving a crisis in public confidence in the Supreme Court. The status quo must change. For those who might suggest that my concern is driven by judicial activism against the current court's conservative philosophy, I and other members of this committee wrote to Chief Justice 11 years ago and urged the court to adopt a code of conduct. I'm going to put the copy of that letter from February 13th, 2012 into the record. The Supreme Court should step up and fix this themselves. For years, they've refused. And because the court will not act, Congress must. Today, we'll hear from a panel of expert witnesses about the kinds of reforms that are needed. And let's be clear, Congress not only has the authority to legislate in this area, but the responsibility. Taxpayers' dollars pay for our federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court. And Congress passes many laws that shape the higher court, from the annual spending bills that pay the justice salaries to the federal statute that establishes the words of the oath of office the justices take. I appreciate the Chief Justice responding to my letters and responding to questions from my Democratic colleagues that I sent about the statement of principles, but the answers we received further highlight the need for meaningful Supreme Court ethics reform. We have the right and rationale to enact such reform, and that's what we will pursue. I want to say that this hearing is being held jointly with the full committee and the subcommittee on courts chaired by Senator Whitehouse, who joined with Senator in making opening statements. At this time, I want to turn it over to the ranking member, Senator Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Today's video is sponsored by. Hi there, welcome to my apartment. This is the entrance to my place. It's the first thing you see when you walk in the door. I have this little hallway here. It has both my bedroom and my bathroom coming off of it. And then this leads into the rest of the space.
I too have expressed the desire for the court to be more transparent, to have rules that the public can relate to. We've been talking about that for quite a while. I've never suggested that the Congress should take over the court's ability to regulate itself. I do not believe that is wise. And the letter that was received by the committee was not just signed by Justice Roberts, it was signed by all of the judges. All of them have the same concern, not just one. So where do we go and what are we trying to do? I think here's what you're trying to do on the Democratic side. Remember when Senator Schumer went to the court and started yelling at everybody in the court? Not everybody, just pretty much our folks. I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions. Awful decisions. We all have been in the boat of getting an outcome the Supreme Court we didn't like. But the majority leader of the United States Senate went before the court, literally out in front of it, and threatened two judges. And Maxine Waters says, you haven't seen nothing yet. So we can talk about ethics, and that's great. But we're also going to talk about today of a concentrated effort by the left to delegitimize this court and to cherry pick examples to make a point. The New York Times wrote an article a couple of days ago suggesting that George Mason Law School was up to an effort to take over the court by lavishing them with trips and influencing their decision-making process by sponsoring trips overseas while they were on. Justice Kennedy took a 3-week multi-trip to Salzburg, Austria, San Francisco, Aspen, Colorado, paid for by the Aston Institute and the University of the Pacific. Justice Sotomayor and Justice Ginsburg traveled to Florence, Italy on the dime of the New York University. Justice Jackson was reimbursed by the University of California, Berkeley in 2016 and 2014 for traveling to the Aspen Institute. Chief Justice Roberts was reimbursed for travel to London to teach a class on the history of the Supreme Court to students of the New England School of Law. So universities throughout this country have been paying for trips of judges. But if you read the New York Times, you wouldn't know that, would you? I can't say I read the New Republic, but this is a headline. the Democrats need to destroy Clarence Thomas's reputation. That's sort of what we're here about. Well, it's not going to work. This assault on Justice Thomas is well beyond ethics. It is about trying to delegitimize a conservative court that was appointed through the traditional process. Your response has been to pack the court. Virtually every member of the Democratic caucus, except maybe one or two, are for expanding the number of judges to dilute the conservative majority that exists today. So, Mr. Chairman, from our point of view, this is not going to work. You can write all the articles you want to write. You can take all the shots at the conservative justices you want to take. You can pick it before their houses. It's not going to stop people from doing their job. This is an unseemly effort by the Democratic left to destroy the legitimacy of the Roberts Court. It's put people at risk. It's put their personal safety at risk. If you want to talk about making the court a better institution, I'll be glad to work with you in that regard. If you want to talk about destroying the court, count me out. And about conflicts of interest, Justice Kagan, who's a fine person, was the dean of Harvard Law School. She's raised $500 million for the law school. When she was dean, that's sort of her job. After she left, she's been trying to raise money for Harvard Law School. There's a case involving Harvard before the court. She's not going to recuse herself. I'm not saying she should. I'm just saying there's a very selective outrage here. And from our point of view, on this side of the aisle, we're going to push back as hard as we can and tell the American people the truth about what's going on here. This is not about making the court better. This is about destroying a conservative court. It will not work.
Thank you, Senator Graham. I might note that the letter that I sent 11 years ago to the court was certainly not any indication of current feelings about court opinions. Another person who's been on this subject for many years is the chairman of the court subcommittee, Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. I recognize him now.
Thank you, Chairman. We are here today because the Supreme Court is playing out of bounds of the ethics rules for federal judges. Justices read the ethics rules in unique and eccentric ways, and when they're caught out of bounds, they refuse to allow any investigation of the fact. The personal hospitality problems I've been pursuing began with Justice Scalia, who took more than 7 dozen undisclosed hunting vacations. Most people know of 2, the one where he was on the Air Force 2 manifest with Dick Cheney, and the one where he died. There were 70 plus more. It was systematized. Some intermediary would ask the owner of an expensive resort, often a commercial property, to extend to Scalia a personal invitation to the resort. Even where the owner was someone he'd never met, Scalia treated as personal hospitality because of the personal invitation and failed to disclose the vacations. Gun industry advocates, fossil fuel folks, and Republican political figures often tagged along. No reasonable reading of the term personal hospitality would cover this, but the Supreme Court let this go on for years. When I challenged the court about this practice, Exhibit 1, I got a blow-off letter. Exhibit 2, basically nothing to see here. So then I asked the circuit courts what they thought about this conduct. I went 0 for 13 on answers. So that would be Exhibit 3. I went 0 for 13 on answers, so I then sent another letter saying I hope their silence didn't indicate some kind of coordinated obstruction. Exhibit 4. I also scheduled a subcommittee hearing. Presto, I was told the Financial Disclosure Committee would examine how the exemption was interpreted. That's Exhibit 5. Almost a year later, 2 weeks before the recent news about Justice Thomas broke, the Judicial Conference updated its guidance to clarify that this sort of non-disclosure violates the law, Exhibit 6. I have no evidence that any federal judge outside the Supreme Court ever used the personal invitation trick, and the Judicial Conference, made up of other judges, firmly shut it down. Regular judges would be loath to use that trick because a complaint about it would go into a proper process and would be investigated and measured against the law and the ethics code, and a conclusion would be reached, and that conclusion could be embarrassing. Only Supreme Court justices refuse to allow their conduct to be investigated or reviewed. My bill would fix that. Here's an example of the no investigations problem. The key fact to determine whether Justice Thomas was bound by law to recuse himself from the first January 6th committee case was what he knew about his wife's insurrection activities and when he knew it. On that fact, the lawfulness of his initial recusal decision turns. Yet Thomas has never been officially asked that question. It's a cover-up in plain view. The Supreme Court alone among federal courts is okay with that. My bill would fix that. Which brings us to Justice Thomas's recent non-disclosure of supposed personal hospitality from a right-wing billionaire and its problems. First problem, private jet travel is not in the personal hospitality exemption, which is limited to food, lodging, and entertainment. Exhibit 7. Some textualist, by the way. Second problem, Thomas said it was okay because he'd asked colleagues. But that financial disclosure committee, it's there to ask about financial disclosure. Setting aside that its name should be included, Thomas knew the committee existed because concerns about his yacht and jet travel gift from this billionaire were referred there in 2011, after some of these gifts were first revealed in this New York Times story, Exhibit 9.
What is the fastest and most effective way to get rid of nail fungus? According to the Mayo Clinic, 3 million Americans every year get nail fungus. It is a chronic condition that is more common as we age. Nail fungus can last for years, even be lifelong, and difficult to get rid of. But a controversial study published by the British Medical Journal revealed a strange nighttime ritual that cleared patients' brown or yellow nails in a matter of days. This strange ritual doesn't require medications, surgeries, or other expensive procedures, and works for any type of nail fungus, brittle or cracked skin. It's so effective that it has a jaw-dropping 98% success rate and has been used by movie celebrities, Olympic swimming athletes, and international heads of state. And now you can use the blue button below to discover this strange fungus vanishing ritual in a powerful presentation, made especially for folks who are worried about their toe fungus. Over 72,300 men and women have already benefited. Folks like you.
Best decision ever. Now my nails look sharp, strong, and healthy. Zero fungus, zero pain and itchiness between my toes, zero problems.
Absolutely sooner than I expected, I started seeing results. And now my nails look so perfect.
Now it's like my fungus problems never existed, and my nails are once again strong and healthy, and my feet don't hurt anymore.
Third problem, there's no legal way not to disclose the property acquisition in Georgia. Fourth problem, some of this personal hospitality involved people dedicated to turning the court into a tool for right-wing billionaires, namely Leonard Leo. This guy doesn't have business before the court. His business is the court. This disclosure mess has again been referred to the Financial Disclosure Committee, which raises the question of the previous referral to that same committee of the same billionaire's gifts to Thomas of yacht and jet travel. The rules seem to require the committee to report its findings to the Judicial Conference. The records of the Judicial Conference are public, and the records of the Judicial Conference contain no mention of any such report. So what became of the 2011 referral? Did anyone intervene? Is the committee still considering the 2011 referral more than a decade later? There is much yet to learn, which is why last week I sent a letter to the courts asking for further answers. Exhibit 10. 3 things are needed to fix all this: better enforcement, better recusal rules, and better disclosures. My bill would do all 3. I thank Chairman Durbin for this joint hearing and look forward to getting to the bottom of this mess. Until there is an honest ethics process at the Supreme Court, these messes will continue. The court has conclusively proven that it cannot police itself. Nemo judex in sua causa. I ask unanimous consent that my exhibits be made part of the record.
Without objection, we now will hear from Ranking Member of the Core Subcommittee, Senator Kennedy of Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Americans may be poorer under the Biden administration, but they are not stupid. They know what's going on here. I remember the Democratic leader's words of March 4th, 2020, on the steps of the United States Supreme Court, like they were yesterday. I want to tell you, Gorsuch, he said, not Justice Gorsuch, Gorsuch. I want to tell you, Gorsuch. I want to tell you, Kavanaugh. You have released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions. Wow. Just wow. I think Matthew 12:36 is correct. For by thy words you shall be justified, and by thy words you shall be condemned. Now, the sad truth is that some, not all, some of my Democratic colleagues have been on a crusade to undermine the United States Supreme Court's legitimacy and the credibility of the federal judiciary for years. Today's the next chapter in their federal pact. And they use fusion that's for God's sakes. The Washington Post.
EVE Online is a vast universe, alive with the unrelenting activity and combined history of its players.
Verdict after. In other words, they gave him a fair and impartial firing squad. Then we saw the high-tech lynching of Justice Clarence Thomas. Then, for the first time in history, they weaponized the filibuster to kill Mr. Miguel Estrada's nomination, and they also demonized Justice Janice Rogers Brown, a very fine person. When the United States Senate confirmed 3 new Supreme Court justices, which the loon wing of the Democratic Party loathed, the campaign of threats ratcheted up. You remember the shouts. Let's pack the court, they said. Let's pack the court. And the political threats of some of the highest officials in our government fueled physical threats against the justices, and we know that. You have released the whirlwind, the Democratic leader said. Incensed protesters took to the streets, not outside Congress, not outside the court, but outside the homes of Justice Roberts, Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Thomas, and Justice Barrett. Federal law prohibits this intimidation, but the Biden Justice Department allowed it. You will pay the price, the Democratic leader said. In that spirit, angry protesters publicized the location of the school that Justice Barrett's children attend. You won't know what hit you, the Democratic leader said. A man with a gun, ammunition, knife, pepper spray, and zip ties went to a justice's home to assassinate him. Actually, his stated goal was to murder 3 justices. Not so suddenly, the ends justified the means for activists. even inside the court itself. The Dobbs decision was not leaked by a left-wing blogger. Why? That's worth asking. You don't need to be Einstein's cousin to figure it out. They aren't getting their way. They aren't getting their way, so they want to change the rules. But the Constitution isn't a game, folks. And now some Democrats want Congress to override the Supreme Court of the United States and apply rules to its justices. The constitutional separation of powers means that no branch of the federal government can dictate how another should govern itself. That's black letter law. Now, why? This is to protect the people from abuse. The framers insulated the federal judiciary from political control to ensure that the justices would decide cases impartially, without fear of the kind of retaliation that fills the pages of some, not all, but some left of Lenin Democrats' playbook. Do my colleagues want the United States Supreme Court to tell Congress how to police itself? Even if Congress wrote a code of ethics for the Supreme Court, the court could rightly rule that code is unconstitutional. None of the laws we make here trump the United States Constitution. What's more, some Democrats want to use the lower courts as a cudgel against the highest court in the land by giving circuit judges the power to rule on whether justices should recuse themselves. Consider the conflicts of interest and the confusion that would breed. Unless you peaked in high school, you must know they will be breathtaking. Now, the absence of an ethics code written by Congress in statute doesn't mean that justices lack guidance or accountability. Justices and judges routinely consult the existing code of conduct, and federal law already requires recusal in certain circumstances, like bias or financial interest. We all know that. The justices are also subject to strict financial disclosure rules, just like my colleagues here. Not only is this Democratic proposal unconstitutional, it is unnecessary. The attacks on conservative justices are targeted. They're exaggerated. The alarmism is affected. The danger isn't that rogue justices are operating without ethics. It's that Democrats aren't winning every fight and they find that reality intolerable. I've been disappointed by Supreme Court opinions too. But my Democratic colleagues should fill out a hurt feelings report and move on for the sake of the Constitution. Look, the agenda-driven story here is that Justice Thomas has a rich friend who had no business before the United States Supreme Court. For context, let's recall that history is littered with examples of public officials failing to disclose their every transaction. We can acknowledge it's required by law. It is. We can acknowledge it's the right thing to do. It is. But we can do that without maligning each justice's motives and the entire institution's credibility, for God's sakes. You know who else amended their disclosures because of inadvertent omissions? Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Stephen Breyer. Two good people. Justice Jackson made multiple amendments 3 days after President Biden nominated her. Not one senator brought that up during her confirmation hearings. Not one of my colleagues here walked into her hearings with the buckets of mud that they've thrown against Justice Thomas. Not one. Nor should we have. In the last month, some, not all, but some Democrats and their media allies have hyped up attempted hit pieces on every Republican appointed Supreme Court justice except for one. They tried going after Justice Kavanaugh for buying baseball tickets, Justice Alito for having dinner with people who gossip, the wife of Chief Justice Roberts for hiring good lawyers, Justice Gorsuch for selling land in an LLC, which he properly disclosed to a major donor to the Democratic Party, for God's sakes, who's never even met. And Justice Thomas for having a rich friend. Justice Barrett, if you're listening, I hope you don't have library books overdue. If recent history is any indicator, you're next. Today's hearing is an excuse to sling more mud at an institution that some, not all, some Democrats don't like because they can't control it 100% of the time. And that's a fact, and everybody in this hearing room knows it. Until they get the outcome they want in every case, I fear they're going to continue to slander it in an effort to take control of it. And I pray to God I am wrong. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. I will repeat what I've said before because I think it bears repeating. Violence against any public official, right or left, Democrat, Republican, or Independent, is unacceptable. We have tried in this committee to pass legislation to make that point clear and enforceable under the law. When it comes to the Supreme Court justices and others, we have an obligation to protect them. And it was Attorney General Merrick Garland who has provided round-the-clock security for Supreme Court justices from the U.S. Marshals at their home, which I think is entirely proper. So there's no question about the bipartisan commitment to their safety. At this point, we'll introduce the three majority witnesses and turn it over to Senator Graham to introduce the minority witnesses. The Honorable Jeremy Fogel served as U.S. District Judge for the Northern District of California from 1998 until 2018. From 2011 to 2018, served as Director of the Federal Judicial Center, the Research and Education Agency of the Judicial Branch. Supports the efficient and effective administration of justice. Judge Fogel, served from 2004 to 2011 on the Judicial Conference Committee on Financial Disclosure. Before his confirmation to the federal bench, he was a state court judge in California. Kedrick Payne is the Vice President, General Counsel, and Senior Director of Ethics at Campaign Legal Center. Previously advised in Executive Branch Ethics Law as Deputy General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Energy, enforced Legislative Branch Ethics Laws and Standards of Conduct as a Deputy Chief Counsel at the Office of Congressional Ethics. Clerked on the Southern District of New York, practiced law at Kravitz Swain. I want to congratulate you on your brand new baby, 2 weeks old. I can imagine how difficult it is to pull yourself away from the family, but appreciate the fact that you're here. Professor Amanda Frost is the John E. Wald Professor of Law at the University of Virginia School of Law. She writes and teaches in the fields of constitutional law, judicial ethics, and immigration. She authors the Academic Roundup column for the SCOTUS blog. Prior to entering academia, served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit and worked as a litigator for Public Citizen. Now I'll turn to Senator Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have former Attorney General Michael Mukasey. Judge Mukasey served as Attorney General of the United States from November 2007 to January 2009, where I oversaw the Department of Justice and advised on critical issues of domestic and international law. Following his time as Attorney General, Judge Mukasey returned to private practice in New York, focused primarily on internal investigations, independent board reviews, and corporate grievance. From 1988 to 2006, Judge Mukasey served as a district judge in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, becoming chief judge in 2000. From 1972 to 1976, he served as assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, as chief of the Office of Corruption Unit from 1975 to 1976. He received his law degree from Yale in 1967 and his BA from Columbia College in 1963. Mr. Thomas Dupree is a partner at Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. Thomas Dupree is a partner co-chairs the firm's nationwide appellate constitutional law practice group, is a seasoned litigator who has argued in all 13 circuits as well as U.S. Supreme Court. He's previously served as the Justice Department during the Bush administration. He served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Division and later became the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General. He was responsible for managing the government's most significant cases involving constitutional matters at virtually all of federal agencies, the White House, and senior federal officials. He's testified for Congress on constitutional matters numerous times. He's graduated from Williams College. Graduated from Williams College in the University of Chicago Law School, where he served as editor at the University of Chicago Law Review. He clerked for Judge Jerry Smith at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Graham. After the witnesses are sworn in, they'll each have 5 minutes to make a presentation. The members will have 5 minutes to ask. And I ask the witnesses, please stand and raise your right hand. The record reflect that all 5 witnesses who answered in the affirmative. Witnesses will be called in the order they're seated. First will be Honorable Jeremy Fogel. Judge Fogel.
This is the world's richest man-verified hair growth method, which allows you to regain a full head of hair. Back in 1999, Elon Musk's hair loss was already quite noticeable. Due to the effects of stress, his body's ability.
Make sure you're.
Yeah, thank you. Got it. Thank you, Chair Durbin. And Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Graham, members of the committee. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I also want to acknowledge, say how honored I am to be here with my fellow witnesses. I think we all have something to contribute to this conversation. As Chair Durbin said, my name is Jeremy Fogel. I am a retired judge of the United States District Court for the Northern California. I served as a federal judge for 20 years and for 7 years as director of the Federal Judicial Center. Relevant to what we'll be discussing today, I worked very closely with the Judicial Conference and its committees when I was FJC director. My primary responsibilities were overseeing policy-related research and educational curriculum for the judicial branch, including judicial education about ethical standards and financial reporting requirements. The Chief Justice chaired our governing board. I had regular contact with him and with the circuit and district courts leadership, and I'm very pleased to say I have collegial relationships with judges all over the country of all judicial philosophies. It's something that's very meaningful to me. Before being appointed as director of the Federal Judicial Center, I was a member of the Judicial Conference Committee on Financial Disclosure for 7 years. I acquired substantial knowledge of the Ethics in Government Act and its application to judicial officers, including the redaction authority that's used to protect filers and families. So the principal point of my testimony is that I think the court does need greater transparency in the way it engages with judicial ethics. I agree with Senator Graham. I want to be clear why I'm here today. I am not here to question or criticize the conduct of any justice, and it's not my purpose to take sides in a political debate, which is an odd thing to say when one is in Congress, but it's truly where I'm coming from. I spent 40 years of my professional life avoiding partisanship. I treasure my relationships with judges across a broad range of political persuasions. And I have great respect for the court as an institution and for the justices with whom I've had the privilege of interacting in the course of my career. I'm particularly grateful to Chief Justice Roberts for his wise counsel and steady support during my time at the FJC. From a personal standpoint, given those relationships and given the respect I have for the judges and justices I know, it's awkward for me to be here. I do not doubt the sincerity of the submissions that the Chief and the justices of the court have made to this committee. I think they are given in great sincerity. I think I'm here because I think more is needed. Over the decades, the court has been our most trusted government institution, far outpacing the legislative and executive branches in polls measuring public confidence. And that status has eroded significantly. Only a decade ago, 2/3 of Americans said they had confidence in the court. And now it's exactly opposite. About 2/3 say that they little or no confidence in the court. And some of that erosion has had to do with controversy surrounding decisions. I think one would be naive not to say that. But there are also other factors at work. There's a persistently hyper-partisan political environment, an increasingly contentious confirmation process, the near disappearance of civics curriculum from our schools, and the pervasiveness of social media as a source of misinformation and disinformation about the law, the judicial process, and the judges and justices to whom that process is entrusted. In this fraught environment, I believe that the absence of a formal structure for defining and validating the ethical rules governing the Supreme Court justices is untenable. Too many Americans already think that the justices decide cases based on their political preferences and alliances rather than the law. Lack of clarity about the justice's ethical obligations only feeds that perception. Every other judicial officer in our country, whether state or federal, and regardless of the type of court in which they serve, is guided by explicit ethical standards and is subject to at least some degree of oversight to assure their compliance. The same is true for virtually all officials in the legislative and executive branches. While people familiar with the inner workings of the federal judiciary can read the court's submission to this committee and admire, as I do, the care and nuance with which it has been crafted, I fear that for everyone else, the processes and considerations that submission details are a black box. How and when do the justices consult the court's sources described? What weight do those sources receive? Who, if anyone, not affiliated with the court is directly available to offer detached and independent judgment and advice? And most importantly, what procedures are in place to assure an appropriate degree of transparency that's consistent with the principles of decisional independence and judicial security. In his year-end report in 2011 and in his recent submission, the Chief Justice has explained how the Supreme Court differs from other federal courts and why it would be inappropriate for it simply to adopt the identical code of conduct applicable to all other federal judges. I agree with him about these points, but that doesn't mean that the court should have no formal code at all, that it couldn't adopt a modified code that accounts for these differences. For example, given the significantly greater impact of recusals on a court with only 9 members and no ability to draw upon potential replacements, the potential provisions of a modified code might identify and weigh factors for and against recusal differently. Because of its unique position in the judicial branch and the need to avoid a review procedure that might compromise its decisional independence or the security of its members, the court could designate a panel of retired judges with deep experience and unquestioned integrity to provide it with confidential advice as to whether an act, omission, or relationship raises an issue under the code. The point is that a formal code of conduct would provide clearly stated, visible rules and procedures to which the justices are expressly committed. Adoption of such a framework.
Second, the Supreme Court does not have a binding code of conduct. Instead of a binding code of conduct, the Supreme Court has stated that it voluntarily follows the regulations of the Judicial Conference while emphasizing that the Judicial Conference does not have supervisory authority over the court. As a result, the court does not demonstrate a willingness to hold itself accountable for conflicts of interest or other ethics issues that are not currently codified in law. On the other hand, the executive and legislative branches have adopted codes of conduct and extensive rules that support public trust in government. Third, the Supreme Court does not have meaningful disclosure of privately sponsored travel. Because of the limited information that is disclosed with privately sponsored travel for justices, there's
If you love Sleepy Joe, then you do not want to see this, because we're giving away these incredible Donald Trump.
Judge Gorsuch and Judge Kavanaugh by name back in 2020, it could lead unstable individuals to decide that they are going to conduct an assassination of these members of the Supreme Court. So things have gotten terribly out of hand. Judge McCasey, you and Mr. Dupree both talked about the separation of powers. I look back at the rules of the United States Senate, our ethics rules by which we are governed. And they are rules that are set by the Senate itself. How do you think the Senate would react if the United States Supreme Court said, we don't like the ethics code of senators?
or members of the House of Representatives, with the same principle of separation of powers and co-equal branches of government apply in that circumstance?
Yes, of course it would, Senator. This body sets the rule for its conduct in the same way that the court sets the rule for its conduct.
Independence or their institutional independence. And I think some judges are frustrated that that hasn't happened.
I agree. I've talked to a number of judges who are more than frustrated. They are livid. I believe their views reflect a growing feeling among the judiciary. All I can say is I urge those judges to stand up and speak out because they can help protect the judiciary as an institution. Thank you.
I have yet to take action.
It's almost stunning that they haven't. I don't want to ask you to speculate as to why not. Clearly, America's faith in their court on both sides, people identify as independent, Republican or Democrat, they're losing their faith in this institution. It's something that is, I'm an X-generation guy, and maybe like many of my generation, we took for granted the rock-solid nature of our democratic ideals and principles until we started seeing them, a very unprecedented things happening with the Capitol being overrun for the second time in American history, not happening before since the War of 1812 and 1814. And so could you maybe at least explain this idea of that the Supreme Court, maybe what the founders had in mind in terms of its urgency to self-govern, to do things that would protect itself from that kind of loss of confidence?
Yes, I think the framers of the Constitution realized how important it was to have a judiciary that was insulated, that its decisions were insulated from political pressure. But equally, the framers realized that they would want Congress to play a role in the establishment of the courts, the lower courts, which are the Congress's choice to create them, and the Supreme Court, which must exist but does not control most aspects of its administration, like its size, like the quorum requirements, like when it meets. Even significant aspects of its jurisdiction are controlled by Congress as the framers intended. And what they intended to do was have Congress ensure that the courts run effectively to serve the nation's interests. And that's what this legislation.
So the last point I want to make, which is something that, again, in all my studies of the founding of our country, this worry about concentrations of power, this worry about the corruptibility of officials should they not have checks and balances.
And now the dynamic of recusal. Back to Professor Frost. Bloomberg recently reported that Harlan Crow, the billionaire Republican donor that gave Justice Thomas hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of gifts and travel over 2 decades, had a financial interest in a case and appealed to the Supreme Court in 2005. And that there's no indication that Justice Thomas recused himself from that matter. In your opinion, how does a situation such as this, with the absence of recusal, impact the public's faith and trust?
Justices, that is maybe their financial reporting and not their recusal decisions. I don't see a constitutional problem. The same way there's not a constitutional problem with a justice being prosecuted if they commit a crime, like any other judge. So no, the lower courts couldn't review the Supreme Court's decisions for the reasons Mr. Dupree just gave, but they certainly could review their ethical conduct off the bench.
What do you think about the, we're the political body. We were envisioned to be that. Right now, they seem to be all doing very well. But it would just seem to me that you'd be creating a framework to where
judges, residents, if the intent is to influence that judge's decision making, and we've
beyond that, once you've done the filtration, if it looks like a complaint has merit, staff attorneys work with regard to the other federal judges to take a look at the complaint and to do a little bit of a factual investigation so that there's a record to decide what's true and what isn't. And that can include asking a question of the judge about what their recollection is of the situation or what their justification is for their a factual record gets made. Again, the Supreme Court doesn't do that. I think there's plenty of room, well within even the more extreme views here, to see this as to, forgive me, Mr. Dupre, but I consider these to be non-core duties of the court to comply with these statutes that are permissible to regulate. The court has already agreed to follow and respect and comply with the judicial conference rules and procedures. It doesn't seem much to have them also ask, not just comply, but ask, what does it take to comply? And get an answer in advance so they know whether it's complied or not. In fact, that's what the Judge Fogel's Financial Disclosure Committee was set up to do. And to take it another step further, to make the advice that they get, which could perfectly easily be from other judges, it's just advice, public, so that there's a clear contrast between what every other judge has to live by for rules and what the justices arrogate to themselves as the rules that they have to live by. And I'll close by reminding everyone of Ben Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac, which advised that the best way to show that a crooked stick is crooked is to put a straight stick down next to it. And I think the circuit courts of appeal and the way they behave right now, overseeing the ethical conduct of federal judges, presents that straight stick. Thank you very much, Chairman, for the hearing.
Thanks, Senator Whitehouse. I'm going to close with a personal note. It was my good fortune as a college student to be an intern in the office of a United States Senator named Paul Douglas from Illinois. And he inspired me to aspire to this life. He was, I think, the penultimate leader when it came to questions of ethics, and took it to a level that many elected office in the 1960s wouldn't consider. He never accepted a gift worth more than $2.50. $2.50. And he made an annual disclosure in detail of his net worth and his income tax returns. Very few, if any others, did it. One person did, his disciple, Paul Simon, whom I also worked with for many years. I picked up that tradition of making a complete, detailed income disclosure, net worth disclosure every single year. I don't know that anybody even notices. My wife did for a few years when we had no money, but no one else really notices that. My goal is to try to make enough disclosure so the questions of my own ethical judgment would at least have to consider that disclosure. I don't know what it takes to restore people's faith in our government or our courts. But this was a good faith hearing on an issue that I raised 11 years ago. It had nothing to do with President Trump. He wasn't the president at the time. It had nothing to do with the agenda of the court today. That was long before that ever happened. I still think this is a valid point. What I hear from the committee today is it's a partisan point. This is now a Democratic cause. I don't think Judge Ludig or Judge Fogel or others, Mr. Tribe, came to this on a political basis. They are looking for a matter of principle, and I still think it's valid. I made my first entree on this issue after the Justice Thomas disclosures with a personal letter, first with a phone call, then with a personal letter to the Chief Justice. I respect him. I really think this is his court, and he can make of it what he wishes. He had a chance to use us if he wanted to. He didn't choose to, or some other means to restore confidence of the American people, at least partially, in the court. So I hope that regardless of what comes of this matter and these pending matters of legislation, that the court will, in fact, heal itself by the justice as leaders, the Chief Justice as leader of the effort. We're going to have a number of statements in the record that will be added with unanimous consent. There may be some questions coming your way. It's rare, but it happens. And if you receive them, I hope you'll respond quickly. Thanks very much for your patience today.